Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. This is a story about what if Naruto was stronger than Hagoromo. Before I start, please support for more amazing content and do consider subscribing to my channel and share this video with your friends. This is written by ViodeOfNexus and link in the description and support writer. Let's start the video. Chapter 1. Prologue. How dare you do this to me? A cold and thunderous voice rang out across the destroyed clearing. I am your mother, I am a god. The voice belonged to a woman, not just any woman however. Her name is both feared and worshipped across the known world. It was revealed to be none other than Kaguya Otsutsuki. She was standing on the far side of the clearing a fair distance away from the two figures standing side by side. Mother. One said in a somber and subdued tone. I am sorry that it has come to this. He continued, the second figure staring at her intently across from him. Your power has brought you nothing but arrogance and corruption. He looked towards the person standing at his side, a slight nod was given to him. Begin the ritual, Homura. The figure hesitated momentarily, weighing his heart against the world. His heart did not weigh enough it seemed. Of course, Hagoromo. And with that, both sped across the field at inhuman speeds, with Homura going through hand seals at a rate most humans can only dream of comprehending. Sealing technique. Displacement of the primordial god Homura called out as he approached Kaguya. But not to be outdone she blurred away from her second son, only to reappear in front of Hagoromo, her first. Shinra Tensha both called out simultaneously. But Kaguya, being the progenitor of all chakra, was not about to be outdone. Her technique was infinitely stronger than her first child's own. He was thrown back by an almighty force and continued sliding along the ground for a couple of meters before correcting himself. Homura was by his side almost instantly. It is of no use. Kaguya said in a surprisingly calm tone. As she looked up they had a clear view of her face. As radiant and beautiful as they could ever remember it. Long silky white hair running down her back and touching the ground, two bangs framing the side of her face running down to just below her ribs. Although there were a few oddities, firstly her pale white eyes had noticeable bulges running from the side of each eye past her temple and stopping about halfway to her hairline. Two distinct red markings above both eyes, a noticeable vertical slit between both. And perhaps strangest of all, two horn-like protrusions just above her hairline, strangely enough giving her a likeness to a rabbit. I have inherited the eyes you so cherish, mother. Hagoromo stated. Whether you have more power or not, we shall defeat you, for me and my brother fight for a higher purpose than you. He stated with conviction. We fight for those who cannot do so for themselves, the ones you have subjugated to your will, they fear you. You are no god. Kaguya's delicate features twisted in rage at his statement. You fool. She shouted, yet managed to retain her air of dignity. You have been trying to defeat me for years now, running just like a dog after every defeat. To fight for a higher purpose than you may think, it might not be in yours, your brother's, or even the world's best interests. But it is in his. Hagoromo raised a single eyebrow. What could she possibly mean, he thought to himself. Hagoromo is a pale-skinned man with spiky, shoulder-length pale red hair. He also sported a short goatee. He has inherited the protrusions on his forehead from his mother. He had Rinnegan eyes and no eyebrows. He also had a red Rinnegan in the middle of his forehead, a circle representing yang in his right palm, and a dark-colored half-moon representing yin in his left. Brother. He shifted his eyes to Homura. What does she mean by that? He asked. Homura, like his brother, had pale skin and similar colorless wide eyes much like his mother's. Similarly, he had two protrusions on his forehead much like his brother. He also had the half-moon representing yin on his left palm. I do not know. Was the simple reply he received. Kaguya suddenly blurred out of sight from them both, and Homura knew pain. There standing over his haunched form was his mother with her fist buried in his gut. The laws of physics and momentum finally caught up with him as he was launched several meters back, leaving a deep trench in the ground. Hagoromo pointed a fist at his mother, and a grinding, metallic noise reverberated throughout the clearing. His fist now looked much like a cannon, with the barrel turning at a slow, menacing pace. The center of the cannon shone blue for a split second, before a beam of pure chakra erupted from the cannon and sped towards Kaguya, vaporizing all in its path of destruction. Only for the blast to simply pass through the goddess. His eyes widened in shock. And it was enough time for Kaguya to capitalize. She immediately appeared in front of him swinging for his neck with a glistening white sword made from her own bones. But thanks to his advanced eyes he barely managed to dodge in time. I tire of these games. Kaguya stated in a flat voice. She proceeded to open the eye situated on her forehead, a red Rinnegan eye with 9 tomo circling the pupil on 4 concentric rings. Should Hagoromo swore to himself. If I don't end this quickly she will start drawing on the Shinji's chakra. Whatever happened to you, mother? He tried, hoping to get a decent response from her, or at the very least buy some time. Off in the distance he could see his brother going through a long complex sequence of seals. It was by pure luck she decided not to use her Byakugan while she had her Rinnegan active. He would have smirked would it not have blown their chance. You were never like this, you were capable of love, not just for us, but for all existence. What made you this way? He pressed. She sent a glare his way screaming death and rage, a terrible feeling welled up in his stomach that he tried to ignore, awaiting his mother's response. You have no idea what it is like. She replied, causing him to lift his eyebrow. To be hated for doing what is right, to such an extent that your own offspring turn against you, the rage and misery that accompany that life cannot be explained in mere words. Hagoromo snarled, that is not what is right, mother. He yelled. You are forcing people into a life of servitude and fear. How can you expect anyone to accept that as a way of life? It is not what is right. Tell me, she replied. What is good and evil? Can you feel it? Smell it? Or even see it? If you cannot prove that something exists, then it does not. Her eyes were alight with fury and disappointment. Why can you not see that what I am doing is not evil, it is simply what must be done? But I do not expect you to understand, not anymore, but he will. Before Hagoromo could respond, she was sprinting forward at an incredible pace, her chakra spiked, and there was a multitude of chakra-enhanced bones flying towards him. Using his eyes he slowed his perception as much as possible and managed to dodge most of the projectiles, however one managed to hit him and dug deep into his side, narrowly missing his left lung. It is over, she said as she approached him with a bone sword in hand. She swung down and he barely managed to dodge the attack. Narrowing her eyes she began to speak. Why draw this out? Why make it more painful than it has to be? Simply stay still and let me erase your existence, forget this world and move on to the next. Even if you were able to defeat me, what would you do next? Bring peace with you idealistic beliefs? I think not. Peace is not brought about by love or acceptance, but by holding power above all the others. Forcing them to see things the way they should be. You're wrong, mother, he spoke. Peace is brought about through understanding the people around you. Even if your enemy stands across from you, know what their heart desires and you shall understand their actions. She gave him a blank, unreadable look. And yet here you stand, in front of your own mother no less, spouting off your hypocritical nonsense. How can you say such things while doing the exact opposite of what you are preaching? I have looked into your heart, he replied, slowly standing up. And all I see is you wishing complete dominance and loyalty, whether it is forced or not. Enough, she said. Join your brother in the afterlife. The smirk on his face gave her pause. Turning, her eyes widened in surprise to see Hamura right behind her, completing the last seal in the sequence. Yuanjutsu. Suicide of the god in space and time. He shouted and instantly kanji erupted from his body and ensnared both Kagaya and himself in a cocoon of highly complex seals and glyphs. Hagoromo, seeing exactly which technique his brother employed to defeat his mother, felt a flood of guilt and heartache overcome him. Brother. Hamuro. You know I cannot complete this technique without outside help, hurry. Hagoromo stared into his brother's eyes for a short moment, but that was all they needed to display the love and kinship they felt for each other. This technique was designed for this exact purpose, and it was decided that the first one to get a chance would use it. Although he couldn't help but wish it was him in his brother's place at the moment. He turned to his mother and started going through THR chain of seals. You were too arrogant and self-assured, mother, you assumed Hamura was dead and didn't even bother to use the chakra you absorbed from the Shinji. This arrogance has led to your downfall. You may not call me that any longer. She whispered, but both heard her. They were quite surprised she wasn't kicking and screaming bloody murder. Suddenly they both felt the oppressing and evil chakra of the Shinji. Hamura started screaming in pain from the corrosive properties of the chakra. Shit. He cursed, speeding up the seals to a blinding pace. Fuin. He shouted just as Kagaya finished her last technique. Ninshu. Bridge of space and time, she whispered to herself as the only object in her personal pocket dimension was sent millennia into the future. Go now, my son. Were her last words before her eyes closed and her breath left her. Hagoromo looked sadly at his brother's corpse, which he would bury after using a Chibaku Tensai to seal his mother's body and create the moon. After sealing the Shinji's chakra into himself. On his deathbed he would split this chakra into 9 different parts. What he would never realize is he only sealed half of the Shinji's chakra into himself. And if he had paid better attention to his mother's corpse, he would have seen the Rinnegan turn white and the chakra coils behind her Byakugan eyes fade away into nothing, leaving only emerald green eyes. Approximately 2,000 years later. Here is in Saratobi, the professor, as he was often called in his youth. Was dearly confused. I thought Kushina was only expecting a single child, he mused to himself, for on the ceremonial throne were 2 infants. One male, the other female. There was an oppressive feeling radiating from them both, obviously an after effect of the Kyuubi being sealed. He mused out loud to himself. Minato must have split the Kyuubi into 2 parts. But why does the boys feel different worse? The female had short bright red hair, bright blue eyes and a massive set of lungs, if the wailing was anything to go by. They were to name her Mito if he remembered correctly. He wasn't sure of the boy though. The boy, with snow white hair with a random streak of black thrown in, the boy with the sharp intelligent emerald eyes. A shiver went down his spine and the wind whispered to him. Naruto, it said. Chapter 1. The beginning. Here is in Sarutobi, the Sandaime Hokage of Konoha, a man with short graying hair, eye wrinkly face and brown liver spots of his face. Was sitting in his office reminiscing about the past 5 years after the defeat of the Kyuubi. Immediately after the sealing took place, he had taken the 2 infants to his office in the Hokage building. The village was in a state of emergency, meaning a complete lockdown of the village. All shinobi were recalled from their missions and placed on high alert. There was always the chance that another village would use the opportunity to plant spies or even mount a full-scale attack on Konoha. The Tsuchikage has always been the opportunistic type, he thought to himself. All the shinobi that were part of the group that were present after the sealing were called directly to his office and sworn to secrecy under the penalty of death. They were not to tell a soul about exactly what the children were. But this is a ninja village, and as such, the secret didn't stay so for very long. 5 days after the sealing, rumors were beginning to spread, rumors of the sealing and the 2 infants used as the vessel. The Hokage immediately had all of the shinobi that were present interrogated by Ibiki, the head of the I&T department, whom he had entrusted with the very sensitive information. But the leak was not among them, leading him to conclude that there was an outside source that had witnessed the sealing and was leaking the information, for what reason, he did not know. Even more troubling was the fact that this person was able to do so right under his and many other experienced Jounin's noses. But that was not what the Hokage was thinking about. About 2 hours after the sealing took place, the female, Mito as she had been named, calmed down. The oppressive and hate-filled feeling disappeared. To anyone who didn't know, she was just a regular child. But the boy was another matter entirely. There was no excess chakra coming from the boy at all. He had one of the high ugas in the no. Take a look at his chakra. And what they found was frightening. The boy's coils were already developed to what a 6-year-old should be. In all the medical knowledge they possessed, they knew that should be impossible. The girls, however, remained normal as a Jinchuriki could get, he supposed. While it was more active than any normal newborn, they were not larger than they should be. The seal can't be defective. He whispered to himself, Mito would be giving of the same feeling he does. He reasoned. He knew it wasn't chakra, as the Hyuga confirmed, the best way to describe it was instinct. A voice at the back of your head screaming at you, this child is dangerous. And you could not help but want to listen, but he was not a shinobi for nothing and managed to ignore this voice most of the time. And then there was the voice he had heard that night, carried on the wind and nothing more than a whisper. He sometimes reasoned with himself that it was just the stress and fatigue of the night that had led to him hearing that voice. But deep in his heart, he knew that wasn't the case. Nevertheless, he had named the child Naruto, just as the voice had told him. He often found himself pondering this child. He was more of an enigma than anything. His sister Mito had the brightest red hair and deep, shining blue eyes, with 3 whisker-like marks on each cheek. She was slightly short for her age, but otherwise healthy. While he had snow-white hair with 2 streaks of midnight black thrown in, it seemed the older he got, the more parts of his hair darkened. And perhaps strangest of all, a deep vertical crease in the middle of his forehead. He also had the deepest emerald green eyes that held an intelligence the Hokage knew should not be there. At least not in one so young. What am I to do with those 2? He said out loud. Orphanage. 12:30 p.m. Just another wasted day were the thoughts of one Uzumaki Naruto. He was sitting on his bed going through the very limited reading material he had. All the old and unwanted books the orphanage had were given to him. He knew he and his sister were treated differently to anyone else. There sitting across the room from himself was his sister, totally oblivious to all happenings around her. Not that there is anything happening. He snorted to himself. The noise drew her attention and she turned her head to him. What did you say, Ani-san? She asked in her sweet and childlike voice, the total opposite of his own speech patterns. He mostly spoke only when he had to, in short clipped tones, belaying the intelligence he held for one so young. While Mito, when prompted, would run her mouth 100 miles a second simply to get her point across. Just thinking. Was the response he gave her. Oh, she said, slightly crestfallen. Her brother was one of the only people to pay much attention to her, so she savored the few times in which they held a conversation for more than a couple of minutes. Of course, this has never stopped Mito from talking when she felt the need. Ani-san. She prodded. Yes, Mito, was her response. Don't you ever feel like people can be mean to us? I think that maybe there is something wrong with us, like the way they look at me and you. I get really scared when they look at me with those eyes. He raised an eyebrow, perhaps she wasn't as naive as he had thought. Seeing her eager face, he decided to humor her with a response. What brought this on, Mito? You have never said anything in the past. She turned her head slightly. I don't know, it's just the way people look at me. She lowered her head. Sometimes I think I did something wrong. And they were treated differently, they were isolated from the rest of the children. When they went out to play they were told to stay in their room, and once the children were done, they would be let outside and left there, only having the other for company. While Naruto never enjoyed the games children played, Mito seemed to thrive on them. And as such, when he was in the mood made it a point to play the games as best he could, if more for her sake than anything else. They were also made to eat in their room, and as Naruto often noted, the food while not disgusting or rotten was never exactly fresh, the bread, seemingly a few days old, and the fruits overripe never sat well with him. Why were they treated differently, he often wondered, but could never come up with a plausible explanation. Decide. You did nothing wrong, Mito. He said, causing her to look into his eyes, tears brimming around the edges of her own. Then why? She shouted. Why do they look at us like we are monsters? Why won't they let us play with the other kids that live here? Why can't somebody just tell me they love me? Her voice started off strong but slowly died down, showing the sadness she felt. I do not know, Mito. Was his simple reply. Seeing the pain and sadness in her eyes as she turned her head away broke his resolve. Mito, he started making her turn her lock eyes with him. I love you, he said after a moment's hesitation. Her eyes widened as she looked at her brother, and suddenly she launched herself across the room and enveloped her brother in the strongest hug she could, all the while crying and clinging to him for dear life. Not 10 minutes later she was asleep in his arms. A small smile graced her face. I do not know why they treat us like this. He whispered to her sleeping form. But I intend to find out. Next day. 10:30 a.m. Naruto and Mito were both sitting in their room. All the children and caretakers had left, leaving them alone in the room. They had already missed lunch, and both were feeling very hungry. The worst part of it all was that the caretakers had locked the door before they left, meaning they could not even go retrieve the apple and slice of bread that usually occupied their plates during lunch. He had convinced her to try reading a book to alleviate the boredom, while he himself was pondering their situation and what could possibly warrant the treatment they received. He was racking his brain for any sort of clues or information relating to them. He was close to something, he could feel it. But it seemed every time he reached out it simply disappeared again, much like how water runs through open fingers. If only there was some way to close those fingers, metaphorically speaking of course. Then the thought came to him, he remembered reading something about meditation. A way to focus and clear one's mind. He remembered the text very well, as he did with everything. He promptly got out of his bed and sat with his legs crossed, and with a small bit of confusion, he eventually to plaque his hands in the tiger seal. He focused all his attention inwards and did his best to regulate his breathing. At first he tried to focus as hard on his thoughts as he possibly could, but something drew his thoughts away from that task. It felt like fire. No, that is not the word he would use to describe it. More like a compressed, tightly wound ball in his stomach that seemed to be fluctuating and trying to break out of its confines. He brought all his focus onto the task of unraveling this ball. At first it was very difficult, as it seemed to not want to cooperate with him, so he tried a different approach, relaxing and letting this ball do what it wants to, as it seemed to have a life of its own. It proved to be easier than before, and the ball started moving in all directions across his body. It felt amazing, he felt for the first time in his life truly free and happy. But there was a second more tightly compressed ball, and at the same time, larger, different. He did the same with this one and let it run through his body as it pleased. It was the most amazing thing he had ever experienced, he couldn't describe it, it was like. It felt like power. A female voice echoed through his head as darkness claimed him. But Mito. Ani-san, what are you doing? She asked as she finished the book and noticed her brother on the floor with his hands in a strange position. He looked like he had been there for a while. When she received no answer she started to approach him. Only to pause mid-stride as a silver energy exploded from his body and started blowing the covers of their beds and his books of the shelf. She stared in fascination until the floor beneath her brother cracked and splintered. As she was forced to her knees her adrenaline spiked and she called out in a frantic voice, Ani-san. What are you doing? She shouted. He didn't seem to hear her. Ani-san. Please stop. You're scaring me. Still no answer. Ani-san. Stop. She screamed as loud as she could, but her voice didn't seem to reach him. She watched as his face set into a smile and malevolent black energy burst forth from his body. As her brain caught up to reality she started screaming in pain as the adrenaline subsided and she realized she had a broken arm with deep burns and gashes, almost like acid was poured onto her. She was on the floor screaming in pain when the Hokage arrived, but before he went into the building, he noticed her screams carried an undertone of worry. That was as far as his train of thought went before the side of the building exploded. At the hospital. Move aside. The Sandaime shouted at the top of his lungs, rushing through the hospital. Mito was being carried by the tiger mask Anbu, and he himself held Naruto, whose body was shaking and was running a fever. Approaching the first doctor he laid eyes on, he began speaking, "You there. Take the boy and girl and heal them right away," he hollered. The doctor, laying eyes upon the two, sneered and turned his nose up. But did as the Hokage ordered. Just thinking about what happened to the last doctor to deny the two medical care made his blood run cold. "Tiger," the Sandame said, and immediately an Anbu kneeling before him, "Stay in the room they are to be healed in. If he tries anything, take him to Ibiki," he ordered. "Hi Hokage-sama," came the reply, and he vanished. 10 minutes later the Hokage was in the room. He first had to go and check on the damages done to the orphanage. "Thank Kami no one was there today," he said out loud. "Where, sir?" the tiger mask Anbu asked curiously. "The orphanage," he said. "They have taken the children out to one of the parks on a field trip. The damage is extensive. They are very lucky," the Hokage stated. The Anbu just nodded his head in understanding, although they better have a damn good explanation to the reason these two weren't with them, he said in a cold tone. The Anbu wisely chose not to respond. "Damn. It's no good, Hokage-sama, there seems to be something blocking all my techniques. I have even tried using needles as an alternative, but they simply break. As soon as the needle penetrates the flesh, it feels like I'm hitting a brick wall. I don't know what to do," the man said, fearing the Hokage's wrath. Hiruzen narrowed his eyes at the man. "How is that possible?" he demanded. "If you are trying to pull something, so help me," the man started shaking in fear as he replied as best he could, "No. Of course not, Hokage-sama." The Hokage slowly closed his eyes and heaved a deep sigh. "Who is the head doctor in the hospital?" The man took a step back nervously and said in a small voice, "That would be me, Hokage-sama." Naruto's vision. He felt like he was floating in the abyss as only darkness was around him. He was aware, but his senses were dead. No sight, no smell and no feeling. As sensations started returning, he noticed he was in a clearing. High in the air as he watched 3 figures battling for dominance. 1 woman and 2 men, however he was much too high to discern any details besides the woman's snow-white hair and the pure white sword she held. Energy seemed to coalesce around her before shooting off like a bullet towards his position. As the energy connected with him, there was no pain as he had suspected there to be. Only a sense of understanding and, strangely enough, love. A distinctly female voice whispered in his ear after this feeling passed, "Look Naruto, look at how they betrayed me. After all I did for them, can you see the resentment they hold?" "Yes." He barely managed to whisper as the voice spoke again. "I have given everything I have to you. You shall be the one to take my place. I have faith that you will do what needs to be done. Will you accept this task from me?" He didn't really know what was happening, but this voice felt familiar, as if he had heard it before. He felt he could trust it, he didn't know why, and he didn't know how. After a brief pause he asked, "What is this task you speak of?" There was no answer for a few seconds, until what felt like an eternity to him, it answered, "I cannot tell that to you now, but it is for the greater good of all. Do you accept?" There was a slight hesitation, but something inside him was at him screaming, he could not ignore it. "I do." "Excellent, as of today you have unlocked the first ability bound to you by my blood. Use it well, as there is still much to come." "Wait. Bound by blood? What do you mean? What ability do you speak of?" There was silence for a few seconds. The bones of a warrior are hardened through battle. He must take his own body and create what he needs, whether to protect what he wishes or destroy what he hates. Before he could ask any more questions, his world faded to black. Chapter 3. All is not as it should be. Sarutobi Hiruzen was currently sitting in his office. To anyone who should venture in, it would seem as though he was doing the paperwork spread throughout his desk. However, he was currently deep in thought. Pondering the situation the two vessels find themselves in. The villagers and shinobi alike were in a state of panic, and he couldn't really blame them. The chakra that the boy released was unlike any he had ever felt before. Those nearest to the epicenter of the blast were reportedly forced to their knees, fighting their own fear for the simple task of drawing breath. There were 24 civilians who could not handle the pressure and simply blacked out. And in the case of one elderly man, dropped to the floor and suffered from a mild heart attack. The man survived. Luckily enough, he would have to take measures he did not want to if this was not the case. How a mere child possessed such powerful chakra was the predominant thought running through his mind, Jinchuriki or not. And then there was Mito. He could not for the life of him understand how she was still conscious when the Anbu arrived. For even him, one of the best Anbu under his command was given pause by the chakra emitted from the boy. And that was just another matter to ponder. How did the child unlock his chakra? It was a difficult process that usually takes up to a month to accomplish, and in very special cases around 2 weeks. Had the boy been told about chakra by somebody and proceeded to practice on his own? And what of Mito? He knew from experience that the Kyuubi's chakra should have healed her in less than an hour. The last time she had hurt herself, he had rushed her to the hospital with a broken wrist. The first doctor he approached refused to heal, the demon as he so eloquently put it. So he had proceeded to the nearest empty room, laid Mito on one of the beds, and calmly walked up to the man. And in a flash faster than lightning, he fell dead with a kunai lodged deep between his eyes. If you account for the time it took for Naruto to get her to the tower and the refusal of the doctor to treat her, it was somewhere in the range of a mere half hour, and by that time, there was nothing to indicate she ever had a broken wrist in the first place. But after 2 hours of waiting at the hospital and no improvements to either, he had to return to his office to complete his work. The village cannot run itself after all. There was a sudden burst of chakra as Tiger sunshined into the room, breaking Hiruzen from his thoughts. Report on Uzumaki Naruto and Uzumaki Mito. The Anbu said as he kneeled before the Hokage. Continue, the Sandaime said in the most neutral voice he could. He might have emotional attachments to the two children, but he could not let that show in the current situation. Currently the boy's condition has not changed at all, doctors have still not been able to successfully use any techniques nor penetrate farther than his skin. He replied. What of the girl? The Hokage asked. Uzumaki Mito's condition has stabilized, it also seems the Kyuubi's chakra has healed her broken arm, the burn marks she received from the unknown chakra have lessened, however they have yet to completely fade. She has to be kept under constant sedation, as the pain from the wound seems to be too much for her to handle. How is that possible? The Hokage asked, it has already been 6 hours since the incident occurred. The chakra from the Kyuubi should have healed her hours ago. The Anbu nodded. That is the assumption I had as well. However, given how much time has already passed, I have come to a very worrisome conclusion. And what would that be? The Hokage asked with narrowed eyes. That the chakra expelled from the boy is stronger than that of the Kyuubis, as it is the only foreseeable way the beast's chakra could be negated in such a way. The Anbu replied without a shred of doubt in his voice and posture. Impossible. The Hokage barked as he stood up. There is nothing with greater power in this world. The Kai being radiated from the aged leader was immense, but highly focused and refined, and it was all being directed towards the Anbu agent. Tiger, knowing that an explanation was in order, did his very best to speak under the stern gaze of Hiruzen. Hokage-sama, given the corrosive properties of Abiju's chakra, the girl's wounds are to be expected, however. The Kyuubi is the most powerful of the 9, and as such should have little to no problem healing the wounds inflicted upon the girl, even if only half of it was sealed into her. The Kyuubi is said to be incomparably stronger than the other 8, which leads me to believe that we are dealing with something we cannot as of yet comprehend. The Hokage was standing as still as a statue as he tried his utmost to understand what Tiger was telling him. It made sense. However frightening that was to consider. I understand what you are trying to say, Tiger, but you are implying that a human child possesses more powerful chakra than the strongest entity humanity has ever come across. Spoke Hiruzen in a tired and weary voice. It is not often so much happens in a single day after all. I have heard enough theories for today, Tiger. Spoke the Sandaime, especially one such as these. Return to the hospital and notify me as soon as one regains consciousness. Hopefully we can find an explanation to all that has happened. Hi, Hokage-sama. Tiger said before disappearing. Hospital. Same day. 7:00 p.m. As Naruto slowly awoke, he became aware of two things. The first, he felt amazing, truly his body had never felt so unrestrained and powerful before. The second, he was not alone. Slowly opening his eyes so that they may adjust to the light, he noticed two figures standing by his bed and conversing quietly. Hokage-sama, came the harsh whisper of his voice, trying to draw the attention of the man. Almost instantly, they were by his side. The Hokage had an expression of relief on his old wrinkly face. He could not see the other man's, as it was hidden by an animal-themed mask. Naruto-kun, he began slowly, giving the boy a chance to adjust before continuing. How are you feeling, my boy? What happened? He managed to choke out, even though he felt amazing, his body was very fatigued. Why and how, he didn't know. Do you not remember? The Hokage asked with confusion etched on his face. You drew upon your chakra, and the results were very surprising. Now it was Naruto who was confused. Chakra? He asked. I am afraid I do not know what that is, Hokage-sama. He was quite sure he had heard the term being used before, but he had no clue as to what it could possibly mean. The Hokage's face faded from the relieved and confused expression it held before, only to set itself into a very neutral and unreadable one. Do not play games with me, boy. He said in a very sharp tone. What has happened because you decided to get a head start or other such nonsense is a very serious matter. Naruto was quite surprised at the tone of voice the Hokage was using, but decided defending himself was the only course of action open to him at the moment. Hokage-sama, I can honestly say I have no idea what happened. What happened? The Sandaime basically shouted. Damn near half the orphanage is nothing but rubble is what happened. The Hokage was angry now. Tiger's theory made far too much sense, and he needed answers to put his mind at ease. Knowing that shouting would get him nowhere with the boy, he tried his very best to calm himself as much as possible and spoke in the friendliest tone he could. Naruto, you need to listen to me now, I need to know the name of the person who told you about chakra and how to unlock it. You also need to explain what happened when you did so. But he wasn't listening, his mind was stuck on two words: orphanage rubble. Where is Mito? He suddenly shouted, surprising himself and the others in the room at the forcefulness in his voice. The Hokage's face softened slightly at his question. She is in the room next to this one. He replied, hoping to get this out of the way so he could get the information he needed from the boy. Jumping off the bed and running towards the door as fast as he could, surprising both the Anbu and the Hokage at just how quickly he was moving. He was never this fast. The Hokage thought in wonder. How is a 5-year-old child moving at low chunin speed? The Anbu questioned himself silently. The slight pause was enough for Naruto to bolt out the door and into the next room. He stopped dead in his tracks when he saw Mito lying on the bed motionless. Slowly approaching the bed, he noticed a faint mark on her right arm, eyes widening slightly. Was that because of me? He questioned himself. She is fine. Her body is just resting from her recovery. He heard a voice say from behind him. Turning, he saw the Hokage staring at him intently, although it was hard to tell with the Anbu. Did I do that? He asked quietly. The Hokage nodded, he wasn't going to sugarcoat the situation. He needed answers from the boy, and if that meant breaking down a few emotional barriers, then so be it. Naruto, you need to tell me what happened. Half of the orphanage has been destroyed and your sister was injured. What exactly happened? I want to know everything. Naruto slowly nodded his head, taking a few moments to get his thoughts in order. He began. Mito and I were both alone in the orphanage. She was reading a book and I was thinking. Here he hesitated slightly, thinking about why we are treated differently to the other children who live there. At this, the Hokage flinched. But I couldn't figure it out. It's like the answer was right in front of me, but I just couldn't grasp it. I remembered reading something about meditation and how it helps clear your mind. It was at this point the Hokage started piecing together what exactly had happened. And it wasn't exactly helping to ease his mind. But when I attempted it, something else drew my attention. He stopped to try and find words to describe what exactly it felt like. Like a tiny ball just behind your navel, correct? The Hokage tried. Naruto nodded. Sort of, it actually felt really big as my stomach. The Hokage looked towards the Anbu member, who was staring at the boy with what he assumed was shock behind his mask. What the boy was describing should be impossible. Chakra should not be so dense or concentrated. Even when he felt out his own chakra, it was only around half the size the boy just described, even considering the difference in their size and mass. But considering the damages done to the orphanage and the state of panic the village was in, he could do nothing but believe the boy. That is the energy we call chakra. Here isn't explained. And you are sure no one explained chakra and the way to unlock it beforehand? The Hokage questioned him. A simple shake of the head was his answer. It actually felt like there were two different kinds. The boy suddenly stated, causing the Anbu to tense. The Hokage's face returned to the neutral expression from earlier. Explain. He ordered. Well, after I let the first one move around freely, I felt a second one. It was even larger, and he paused, searching for the right words. It felt more uncontrolled and thicker than the first one did. The Hokage was almost afraid to ask, but he did so anyway. How much larger? I don't really know, Hokage-sama. Well, it was larger than the first. It also felt different. It's like comparing the ocean to a lake. There was a sharp intake of breath, and the Hokage turned to see Tiger standing as stiff as a board. Only 3 years of dealing with situations and seeing things that would break any other man was he able to stay relatively calm. On the outside at least, it was the first time dealing with a situation such as this after all. And as such, his thoughts were traveling a mile a minute, doing his best to comprehend what exactly this child was telling him. I see. He said. With a little more force than he had intended. You may wait here for your sister to wake up. When she does, I expect both of you in my office immediately. Tiger, we have much to discuss. And with no further exchange of words, both disappeared from the room. Underground base. Several hours after the incident. As he walked along the dark hallways where he spent most of his days, his cane cracking against the ground every time he took a step, a small smile made its way onto his bandaged face. Today was the day he would get something he had been craving for a long time. After years of waiting, his patience had finally paid off. Reaching his destination, a large hall with a single throne-like pedestal at the very back, situated at the top of a short flight of stairs. As he made his way towards it, a single man dropped down in front of him. My lord, your guest has arrived and wishes to speak with you. The man in an Anbu uniform with a tipples tanto and blank white mask spoke. Excellent. The man with the cane replied, send him in immediately. The man disappeared with no further exchange of words. As he made himself comfortable on his throne, he couldn't help but feel excited. He had been waiting so long for this day, and it had finally arrived. He watched silently as a man clad in a black uniform with a few lines of red thrown in walked towards him, diligently followed by the blank masked Anbu, eyes of red and black glowing as he did so. "I see you have finally arrived," spoke the bandaged man. "Do you have it?" The man with the red eyes nodded slightly, showing him the sealing scroll he held in his hand. With a flourish he unsealed its contents. A single jar with 2 eyes, exactly like the man's own. "I have the eyes as promised. If you fulfill your end of the bargain you shall receive the rest of them as we have agreed." The bandaged man smirked as he gazed onto his prize with his single eye. Not for much longer, he thought. But he had one more thing to confirm. "And you are sure these are the eyes of Shisui?" he asked. The other man nodded. "I would know, I removed them myself." "Very well then," the one-eyed man said, "although I am not complaining, rather curious as to why you approached me. I would have thought that you of all people would have attempted this sort of thing alone." The other man spoke with slight disdain in his voice. "Well, I am confident in both my clan and myself. I am not stupid. If we went up against an entire village we would surely be slaughtered. I came to you because I have heard very interesting whispers of your expertise pertaining to matters such as these." A small smirk graced the other man's face. "Very well, until we meet again. Fugaku." "You as well, Danzo." "Mito's mindscape." "Ani-san." Mito called out once again, her voice echoing along the empty corridor she currently found herself in. For the past 20 minutes she had been aimlessly wandering through intersecting hallways that seemed to stretch on forever with no end in sight. She was currently pondering how she got in here. It appeared to be a prison, with cast iron doors around every corner and along every hallway. But what really drew her attention were the 2 pipes lined on each wall. The first was very large and seemed to be leaking a red acidic-like liquid. Every time a drop touched the floor it would hiss and a small cloud of smoke would be released into the air, only for the ground to almost immediately seal over. The first 5 minutes she was here, she simply watched the process repeat itself over and over. Quickly becoming bored of the repeated phenomenon, she began to search for a way out. And more importantly, find her brother. She paid no attention to the much smaller pipe directly underneath the first, as it did not seem to be doing anything out of the ordinary. She was quickly becoming bored of the endless walking, with no exit in sight and no idea where Naruto could possibly be. She slumped against one of the walls, slowly sliding down to a sitting position. The last thing she could remember was her brother radiating that powerful and frightening energy. She could recall how scared she was at that moment. But at the time that was just an insignificant thought at the very back of her mind, telling her to run while she still had the chance to get away from the overpowering energy being released by her brother. But her mind was overcome with the concern she had for him. If she had felt the way she did, she didn't want to think what it was like right in the middle of it all. But thinking of the smile that had made its way onto his face truly put her on edge. It was almost like he was enjoying it. But that couldn't be the case, could it? The energy and the feelings that had accompanied it were terrifying. All she had wanted to do was latch on to her brother and beg him to stop, but she was unable to at the time. She had been rooted to the spot in fear and the instinctual desire to flee. Broken from her thoughts as a warm gust of air hit her in the face, she immediately stood. That was the first current of air she had felt since waking up. Quickly deducing that it must be a way out, she started rushing towards the source, turning down random corridors and following the warmth the air provided. Although she did feel that something wasn't right, the air came in precisely timed bursts that did not seem completely natural. Turning another corner, she saw a bright light at the very end. Smirking as she thought she had found a way out, she picked up as much speed as she could. Only to come to a grinding halt as a feeling of pure evil and terror washed over her. In front of her stood massive bars, stretching farther up than her eyesight allowed her to see. Each bar seemed to be as thick as a fully grown man, and right in the middle of it all was a single slip of paper with a kanji seal on it. As she was staring, completely transfixed by the scale of such a thing, 2 blood-red eyes slowly opened behind their cage. "So it seems my container has finally decided to grace me with her presence. Tell me, mortal, how long has it been in the outside world?" Mito could only stand there in shock as she gazed into the eyes of the terrifying beast, unmoving and unable to form a coherent sentence as her mind drew a blank. "Speak, mortal. For you are trying my patience," the beast spoke in an agitated voice. As it did so, light seemed to flood in from behind it, allowing Mito to see the head of a fox and 9 tails flickering behind it, each one thicker and more intimidating than the bars that bound it. What are you?" was the only thing she could say at the moment. The beast's eyes narrowed as she asked the question, almost expecting it to lunge and tear her apart. So she was genuinely surprised when it answered. "I am the strongest of the 9 Bijuu," it said in a loud and booming voice, purveying the sheer size and magnitude of the entity, the one you humans saw fit to call the 9 tails. Mito's eyes widened at the implications, and she took a step back in fear. If this was truly the 9 tails, why was it here? Wherever here is. She decided to ask just that. Why are you here? The Yondame Hokage killed you 5 years ago. So it has been 5 years, he beast said under its breath, but to her, it might as well have shouted for all the difference it made. As it turned its attention back to Mito, there was a glint in its eye. Very well, mortal, since I have nothing else to do and no way out of this cage, I shall tell you about that night. And perhaps we can even come to some sort of agreement. At this, its face twisted into an ugly mockery of a smile, a truly evil and terrifying sight to behold. Dost know this, all is not as it should be. Hospital. Soon after Hiruzen left. Naruto had been patiently waiting for his sister to regain consciousness, resting his head next to her on the bed, whispering silent apologies. It had only been a couple of minutes since the Hokage had left him with her. I did not think you would be so close to her. A voice suddenly rang out directly behind him. He jumped, quickly spinning around to assess the threat the person who spoke posed to his welfare. Only to be given pause, for standing directly in front of him was the strangest man he had ever seen. He was garbed in a pitch-black cloak with what seemed to be a plant growing out of either side of his neck, stopping just past the top of his head, and green-colored hair. But the strangest thing was the man had 2 very distinct colors of skin, splitting his body perfectly in half, one side pitch black and the other a pure white. My, so jumpy, he spoke with 2 very distinct tones of voice. Who the hell are you? Naruto spoke with fear in his voice. This man could have easily killed him if he so wished. Me? Well, I suppose you could say I am a close family friend, he said with a smile on his face. The only family I have is Mito, Naruto responded with an edge to his voice. The man looked confused. She did not tell you? I suppose it does not truly matter. But still, I wonder why. Who are you? Naruto asked with much more force and venom in his voice this time. Who, me? The plant man answered innocently, you can just call me Zetsu. He stated. What do you mean by family friend? Naruto asked. You shall find out later, when she deems you ready. Spoke Zetsu. Who is it you are talking about? Said Naruto, narrowing his eyes. An amused smile spread across Zetsu's face, just imagining what Naruto's own would look like after his next statement. Why, the woman who spoke to you after your little episode, of course. He was not disappointed, the look of shock that spread across his face was priceless. How do you know about that? Naruto shouted, I haven't told anybody anything about that. How I know does not matter. If she chose not to tell you, then it is not my place, but I am her will that has been given life. And you are the one who will bring her dreams to fruition. Before Naruto could reply or ask any more questions, the man threw a scroll at him before sinking into the ground, leaving behind no evidence that he had ever been there. Glancing down, he saw the single word that was printed on the very front of said scroll. Shikatsumayaku. Chapter 4. Beginnings of a Legend. It was a peaceful day in the village of Konoha for most of its citizens, simply going about their day in peace. The market was bustling with activity and the laughter of people, buying and selling their goods. It was just a normal day. That is until a blur came racing through the streets, kicking up dust and blowing items of their stalls, too fast for any civilian eye to catch. Loud cries of anger and indignation followed in its wake, as well as curses from the owners of the stores, whose items had been damaged or broken from the fierce winds. But before anyone could even fully recover from their surprise, the winds died down and the blur disappeared behind a corner further down the street. He continued running even after the shouts and curses had long been lost to the fierce winds that roared behind him in his wake. He could not stop now, not when he had an armful of stolen produce. It would not do to give the villagers even more reason to hate the demon. Turning the final corner and shooting up the flights of stairs, taking them in threes. He finally reached his destination, a small rundown apartment with the paint peeling and the walls cracked, but that mattered little to him. The only thing that did matter was what was waiting inside for him, or rather who. Taking a deep breath from the experience he had accumulated over the years, he slowly turned the handle of the door. A red blur shot towards him as fast as it could possibly move, and once again Mito had latched firmly onto him. This was a daily occurrence, it didn't matter how long he had been gone, she was always there to greet him like this, and it made him feel happy. "Ani-san," came her cry of happiness. "Where did you go this time? Why did you take so long? Did you get the food? Did anybody see you?" The questions were shouted so quickly and with such urgency it left her slightly out of breath. "Calm down, Mito," he said soothingly. "I had to go further into the market today than I usually do. The Sandames had ninja patrolling the areas I usually visit. Do not worry though, nobody saw me." She looked at him with a face full of relief and happiness before it changed into one of hope and desperation. Before she could even ask the question he knew she would, he answered it. "Do not worry, Mito," he said with the faintest of smirks on his face. "I have the ramen." She immediately brightened up and sent him a smile bright enough to light the entire village. "Arigato, Ani-san." "Mito, we have much to do today, you can eat when we are finished," he stated calmly. Her face fell slightly before she straightened up and put a small smile on her face once again. "Hi, Gigi wanted to see us, right?" she said happily. His face set itself into a small frown as he thought of his relationship with the Hokage. It had been strenuous for the past 3 years, ever since the incident with his chakra. That is also the reason they now lived alone in a one-bedroom apartment. The orphanage refused to allow them to return, and both were now stuck living in this dump. "Hi, I believe Hokage-sama wishes to speak with us about our entrance into the academy," he said slowly, doing his best to keep the emotions out of his voice. Her eyes immediately lit up with excitement and wonder. "Gosh," she cried happily, "I'm going to be the best ninja ever. And then I'm going to become the best Hokage ever, Databao." He gave a small smile at her enthusiasm, hiding his own excitement at the thought of furthering his own skills. "I know you will, Mito," he thought to himself, "I know you will." Hokage's office. The Sandane was sitting in his office enjoying the pleasures of tobacco. It was a slow day in the office, and therefore the paperwork was minimal. He looked towards the pile on the corner of his desk that had been stamped complete with a small smirk. Yes, today was a good day. The frown slowly made its way onto his face as he thought about the visitors he was expecting. They would not be happy with the news he had for them. A knock on the door drew his attention away from those thoughts. The chakra was unmistakable. "Speak of the devil," he murmured before clearing his throat. "Enter," he commanded. The door opened, revealing both Mito and Naruto. Mito was short for her age with blood-red hair that went down to her lower back and sparkling violet eyes. Her bangs were slightly parted with a clip to keep her hair out of her face. She was dressed in baggy black pants that stopped at her ankles with dark blue sandals on her feet. She had 3 distinct whisker-like marks on her face. She wore a red shirt a few shades darker than her hair with a dark orange jacket. Naruto looked the opposite, however, preferring darker or neutral colors. He had on a pair of dark gray pants that went down to his ankles with black sandals on his feet. He wore a black shirt which showed of the impressive muscle he had for an 8-year-old, and over his shirt, he wore a very dark red jacket that was almost black in color. His hair had also been grown out. 2 pitch black bangs framed his face, almost going down to his chin, while the rest was a pure white resembling freshly fallen snow. It had been grown out to just below the boy's shoulder blades. The Hokage had always found himself in slight wonderment at the contrast of the 2 colors. But now was not the time. After both gave a small bow, Naruto forced Mito to do so as she seemed too excited to remember the courtesy. He spoke. "Hokage-sama, Mito and I are here on your request. What is it you wish to speak to us about?" The Hokage hid the frown that threatened to appear on his face by interlocking his finger directly in front of his mouth. "He is already so distant, this will simply push him further away, but it is the only option I have," he thought to himself. "Yes, Naruto-kun, as you both know, the academy starts next week Monday. But unfortunately I have some rather upsetting news." Mito looked at the Hokage with confusion etched onto her face. Naruto seemed to have a perfectly emotionless visage in place, but the Hokage did not miss the almost imperceptible narrowing of the boy's eyes. "We will not be allowed entrance." It was not a question. "Unfortunately, Naruto-kun, it is only you who has been barred from the academy. After your incident 3 years ago, the council has seen it prudent to keep their children out of harm's way in the case something like that had to happen again." "What?" Mito shouted, completely outraged at what the old man was saying. "You can't do this to Naruto-kun, Gigi. It's just not fair." "What am?" Naruto cut her off before she could finish her sentence. His voice was laced with anger which he refused to show on his face. The Hokage had never seen Mito shrink into herself the way she did when admonished by her brother. He put those thoughts at the back of his mind as he shifted his eyes to regard the white-haired boy once again. "Hokage-sama," he said with as much control as he possibly could, "I do not understand the reasons behind this decision. How is it that Mito will be allowed attendance while I am cast aside? To the best of my knowledge, Konoha is a dictatorship, with the Hokage having the final say in all military-related issues." The Hokage withheld a deep sigh from escaping his throat as he steeled himself for the explanation to come. "Naruto-kun," he started slowly, "the problem lies in the fact that this is not a military-related matter, not entirely anyway. While the academy does prepare children for the life of shinobi, it is in the end a school full of children, both from shinobi as well as civilian backgrounds. The civilians are given around 50% power in civilian-related matters, with the Hokage holding the other 50% to preserve the balance. But you are correct in the fact that I control every aspect of the military in this village. The clans may only be called to vote if something is deemed a threat to village safety or our way of life." He could see Naruto was about to interrupt his explanation, so he simply raised his hand to silence the boy and continued. "And while usually it would be possible for the Hokage to usurp any decision made by them, the fact is this problem has never arisen before, and you are only considered a shinobi and part of the military system when you wear the village's headband, therefore both civilian and shinobi voted on this matter. In the end it was decided you would not be allowed to attend." He could see the thinly veiled anger behind the boy's eyes as he processed the given information. This still does not explain why I am the only one who will not be allowed to attend Hokage-sama. He said those words with such distaste that it almost made Sarutobi flinch. Almost. You are too intelligent for your own good, Naruto Hiruzen thought to himself. He cleared his throat before he continued. The council is not allowed to vote on any matters besides the ones that could be considered a threat to the village. They used this loophole to bar your entrance. And in the case of Mito, she has never done something that could be deemed as such, they therefore did not have the power to stop her from attending. Gigi. Mito suddenly cried out. Please, you can't do this to Ani-san. He never meant to do that to the orphanage. What am I supposed to do without him there to help me? She had noticeable tears in her eyes and desperation in her voice. The Hokage had steeled his heart to the proceedings. There was only one way out for Naruto, and it was the last thing he wanted to subject the child to. There was something burning behind the child's eyes as he stared Hiruzen with the most chilling look he had ever seen in his time as a shinobi. It was the look of a man who had his dreams ripped away and thrown in his face. If that will be all, Hokage-sama. He said with absolute hatred in his voice. It seems as if his choice had been made for him. He looked towards Mito. Mito-chan, please wait outside my office, he said in a soothing voice. There is something I wish to speak to Naruto about. If he agrees, he may tell you. She looked at her brother with tears threatening to spill as she slowly started her trek out, only to rush to his side and envelope him in a fierce hug. I'm so sorry, Ani-san, she said, finally letting her tears fall. She ran as quickly as she could out the office, knowing her brother's only dream had been all but crushed. He looked towards the Hokage with anger shining in his eyes. He wanted to simply attack the man, the anger that was coursing through his very existence almost made him do so, but he was nothing if not rational and knew nothing would come of it besides a frigid cell and 2 cold meals a day. He opened his mouth to speak, only to be cut off by the Sandame. I know what you are going to say, you do not need to. I know I have failed you once again, Naruto, I am truly sorry for that. But as I have said, in this particular situation I had no control over what has happened. No control. He basically snarled at the Sandame. You're the Hokage. You should have complete control of all the inner workings of the village, what am I? Naruto, the Hokage said in the most serious tone he had ever used on him. These regulations were put in place by the Shadame and Nidame Hokages, both of which were my senseis. I hold all their teachings in high regard. These were the 2 that set the entire system for our village, and while there are some flaws in this system that has kept us a cut above the rest. He sighed as he looked upon the boy. His body and posture showed no sign of hostility, but his eyes burned with an anger and rage he had never seen in one so young. It seems as if he would have to allow him the choice. What would you do to become a shinobi, Naruto? He asked suddenly. There was no hesitation as he answered. Anything. And what would you give up? He asked. Everything. Even Mito? This was the question that would determine whether or not he would extend the grapevine. It had the desired effect as it threw the boy off balance. After getting over his surprise, a look of intense conflict appeared on his face. It took him little less than 5 seconds to reach a conclusion. No. The Hokage gave a small smile to the boy and an internal sigh of relief. It seems the child had the right priorities. Very well then, how would you like to join the Anbu, Naruto? What? I thought that he trailed off as he realized what the Hokage was doing. A small smile made its way onto his face as he bowed. It would be my honor, Hokage-sama, he said with true gratitude in his voice. Very well then, Naruto, next week when Mito begins the academy, come to my office. I will see to it you are a registered Anbu by the end of the day. Spoke the Sandame in a kind voice. Thank you for this opportunity, Hokage-sama, I shall do my utmost. Naruto stated. Ah yes, about that, Naruto-kun. Would you care to explain your late-night excursions into the forest? Surely you did not think you could hide such a thing from me. Hiruzen stated with a small amount of smugness in his voice. For the first time he could remember, Naruto found himself unable to respond. He had made absolutely sure no one had followed him, so that begged the question. Just how in the hell did the Hokage know? No need to be so tense, Naruto-kun, I have seen you train yourself into the ground. But the question still stands, why did you not come to me when you discovered this ability of yours? Hiruzen was enjoying the look spread across the boy's face. It was nearly impossible to surprise the boy, let alone make him so flustered, so he took immense pleasure in the few times he was able to garner such a response. Hokage-sama, he started slowly, unsure just how to respond. With all due respect, if anyone were to come to know of my bloodline, I would not only lose the element of surprise, but I would have multiple people out for my head. I have done extensive research on both the bloodline and the clan it once belonged to, and from what I could gather, they were not very well liked. Furthermore, it could call into question my loyalty to the village as a whole. Many people would claim that I am not a born and bred Konoha citizen, and even though I was raised here my whole life many would accuse me of being a spy. It would have simply caused far too many inconveniences had it become public knowledge. He drew in a long breath after the explanation. Not being used to speaking so much at any given time. The Sandaime leant back in his chair and refilled his pipe, mulling over the child's answer. Well, from the boy's point of view it made sense, as the Hokage he could not let matters like this slide, such a thing was far too important to the village to be kept a secret. That may be Naruto-kun. But keeping such delicate information from the Hokage is tantamount to treason. The only reason I cannot and will not punish you for this is the simple fact that I am as of yet not your commanding officer. I do however urge you in future not to keep this sort of thing quiet. Understood? He started off lightly but the statement at the end was said with the power and force of the village leader. I will be sure to keep your words under consideration, Hokage-sama Naruto stated, his voice completely neutral. Hiruzen wasn't completely sated, especially by the boy's vague answer. But nonetheless he waved his hand in dismissal. With Mito. She was depressed, there were no other words or phrases that could describe her current emotional turmoil. On one hand, her brother was not going to be a ninja, she couldn't fathom being without him for hours each day, and moreover, his one and only dream had been shattered. She wanted to be a ninja alongside her brother, she just knew they would be the best ninja ever. Suddenly, her head shot up and her tears stopped falling. That's an amazing idea. She shouted as she stood up. What is? As she whipped around with her scream stuck in her throat, she caught sight of her brother, her face lit up, and her surprise was forgotten as she wrapped her arms around him in the fiercest bear hug she could manage. Ani-san. I have the best idea. I'll teach you what I learn from the academy every day when I get home. You'll learn what I learn. Then when I'm Hokage I'll make you a jounin. He stared at her in slight surprise for the first few seconds after her announcement, watching as her self-satisfied grin stretched further and further. Why does she care so much? He asked himself. Ani-san. She prodded. He snapped out of his surprise and looked Mito dead in the eye, his face was blank and emotionless, but his eyes, she had learned to read him through his eyes a long time ago. He was happy, genuinely happy. He slowly started to wrap his arms around her and in a small and quiet voice filled with emotion, whispered to her. Thank you so much. 1 week later. Mito was humming a cheery tune and skipping along the ground as she made her way to the academy. Her brother explained what was happening and how he was to join the Anbu when they had gotten home. Needless to say, she had been happy, although slightly crestfallen, that she would not be able to see her brother as much as she wanted. When she asked how it was possible to join the Anbu and yet not the academy, he had explained that it was a division of skilled ninja under direct control of the Hokage, therefore he had the final say in any and all matters regarding them. Thinking back on the day confused her somewhat as she thought when her brother hugged her like that it was because of her offer to train him, but it seems it wasn't. Although that didn't really matter anymore, she had felt so happy when he hugged her like that, she had sworn to herself to find out why he did so. Her thoughts were cut off as the bell rang. Oh no. I'm gonna be late on my first day. She immediately shot off to find class 302A, and it was only 10 minutes later when she did so. With Naruto. The Sandaime watched the boy with a careful eye as he greeted him and bowed. He was still not entirely sure this was the best course of action, but it was the only one available, he reminded himself. Naruto-kun, it's good to see you my boy, he said with the faintest of smiles on his face. He glanced over at Tiger who was standing to his direct right, knowing he would catch his intentions. He stepped forward and cleared his throat. Naruto Uzumaki, it has come to my attention that the Hokage wishes to enroll you as a trainee in the Anbu, and as such you will become my responsibility to train. Know that this is the highest honor a shinobi can receive, and if it were not for your previous self-imposed training, you would not even be considered for such prestige. The boy bowed his acknowledgement. Very well, Tiger said, there is still one more thing for us to discuss. And that would be? The boy asked with a slight raise of his eyebrow. This training will be unlike any you can imagine, you will be pushed beyond your breaking point, your stamina will mean all but nothing, there will be no breaks, no mercy, and certainly no pity from any of us. Your chakra will be next to non-existent at the end of each day, your bones will snap and you will have to carry on. Question being, are you ready for this? Tiger said with a heavy voice. A small grin stretched its way across the boy's face. Tiger-san, I am more than ready. I'm excited. Chapter 5. Crimson Flows. It was amazing really, the grace with which he moved, seemingly gliding from one opponent to another as water would around stone. It was akin to the sweetest melody he had ever heard or ever would, it was so surreal, watching as his death moved ever forward. The katana cut towards the monster's neck at that moment and ever so easily did he move, just far enough for the tip to pass his neck, a strand of hair would have had a hard time fitting between, and another of his men fell. It came too late, the realization that he was just standing there, waiting for his death. And only when his chest suddenly flared in pain did he understand that it didn't matter, even had he run, he would have still perished. He turned his head slightly to look at the others who stood dispassionately watching him, seemingly without a care in the world. The one cocked his head to the side, as if asking what was wrong. He tried to chuckle, but it came out as more of a rueful cough. He died silently. Tiger cocked his head to the side as he watched the man die, impaled by a sword as he was. His newest recruit had performed admirably and had his support and recommendation. Directive 7, he ordered softly, as he watched the 4 other soldiers under his command move to dispose of the bodies. He slowly wandered over to the small form of the child who had just killed a man 10 years his senior. The blank mask had turned to him before he could speak. Is it always this easy? Tiger considered these words. He had learned to suppress any guilt long ago. He would be driven mad, otherwise it shouldn't be, not for one so young, although your training demands otherwise. The child nodded slowly as a hand moved up to grip his heart. I feel something, but that isn't what I'm asking. He felt a bit of relief at that, but also confusion. Then what do you mean? The blank mask slowly moved back to the body at its feet. Why does life slip away so quickly? The question was asked softly, but his entire team paused to listen to the child's words. Is this really all there is to life? Kill or be killed, and to forever live with the guilt that you were the one to survive. Tiger stayed silent at that, realizing the child was talking to himself at that moment. His team went back to work as he stood silently watching the child come to terms with what he'd done. Report the 3rd Hokage ordered softly as he sensed a multitude of chakra signatures shunshin into his office. Hokage-sama. Tiger bowed. Mission complete. Hiruzen nodded. Secondary objective. Tiger shifted his gaze to the small form with the blank mask. Successful. New recruit is fit for duty. With your authorization and my recommendation he may start next week. Very well. Saratobi nodded as he turned his attention to the small form of the child. Report in Monday at 700 hours for your first official assignment. He made a motion with his hand and he flickered out of sight along with the rest of his agents, all but Tiger. He sighed softly as he leaned into his chair and pulled his pipe from his desk, slowly filling it with tobacco. How was he asked as he lit the pipe and inhaled. He exceeded my expectations, Hokage-sama. Tiger answered. That is to be expected, but you know that wasn't what I asked you. The 3rd grimaced slightly as he addressed one of his best agents. The Anbu nodded slowly. He seemed shaken, sir, but I expected much more of a reaction than I received. Hiruzen slowly closed his eyes. Keep an eye on him, monitor his reactions to any and all kills that follow, make sure we aren't creating a monster. Tiger inclined his head. I understand, Hokage-sama. He moved silently over the rooftops, ever closer to his destination. He was filled with elation as he moved his hand over his smooth mask, unmarred and plain, a simple thing not at all like the one he'd receive upon his official indoctrination into the Anbu Special Forces. He moved it off his face and into his cloak, only to reveal emerald green eyes that shone with fulfillment. He'd finally done it. He was finally ready to move on, finally strong enough to be a shinobi. His thoughts came to a halt as he reached the roof of Konoha's academy, where he knew they were practicing taijutsu. It seemed he was just in time too, as a small form with red hair wandered into the ring, followed closely by a raven-haired boy with the crest of the Uchiha on his back. You better get ready, Sasuke. Mito exclaimed with a raised fist, a fire burning in her eyes. I'm gonna kick your ass again today. The raven-haired youth scoffed as he moved into his family's fighting stance. Please, Uzumaki, as if you could. A cocky smirk made its way onto his face as he gauged her reaction. Even with his words, he knew not to underestimate her. Mito surged forward, fist raised and ready to unleash a devastating punch. That's not what you were saying last week when your face was buried in the dirt. She threw the punch. Sasuke knew better, however, as he moved forward and blocked the kick that flew toward his face in the wake of the punch, merely a feint. The jab he sent in retaliation clipped her left shoulder, but before he could capitalize, her hands had moved up to grab his wrist as she turned and used the momentum to flip him over her shoulder. He landed on his feet at a very uncomfortable angle, nearly horizontal to the ground. He saw her smirk as she twisted. He refused to cry out from the pain as his wrist bent unnaturally, and in a feat of incredible strength and dexterity, he pulled himself towards her, ignoring her look of surprise and the flare of pain it brought him as he curled his body and sent his knee toward her face. It connected, but not as solidly as he would have liked. Instead of the satisfying crunch of a broken nose, he heard a small grunt as his knee impacted her chin. She released him swiftly and moved back with the blow, trying to reduce the damage by moving with the momentum of his hit. They stared each other down in silence after that. His wrist was throbbing, and he could see the grimace on her face. He was panting quite hard. Well, Mito didn't seem that tired, but she was disorientated from the blow. He moved quickly, knowing this might be his best chance at ending the fight swiftly. She moved sluggishly as she attempted to block his punch, sent desperately without his usual fines. It closed in quickly and hit her solidly on the cheek. He was about to smirk until he felt his breath leave him as they both stumbled back, Mito dropping her knee she had brought up into his stomach at the last second. It was all they could do to keep standing. They were about to go back at it when they were called by their sensei, declaring it a tie. Iruka shook his head as he watched his two best students practically tear into the other. He knew they respected one another, both being at the top of the class. One would hold the spot for a week or two before the other would take their place. He winced slightly as Sasuke buried his fist in the girl's face, and her knee sank deeper than looked comfortable into his diaphragm. "That's enough," he called out just as they were about to get back into it. "It's a tie." Sasuke looked put out and Mito pouted, but both moved towards him as he smiled. "Well done, the both of you did very well, but can you tell me what you did wrong?" The girl scratched the back of her head with a grin. "I thought Sasuke wouldn't be able to move once I got him over my shoulder. I underestimated him." The teacher nodded happily and looked over at the Uchiha, who was looking anywhere but at him. "I moved in recklessly thinking she was defenseless. I dropped my guard and paid the price." He rubbed his tender stomach, looking put out at having to admit it. Iruka smiled brightly at his most promising students. "Very good. Remember, admitting your faults is the first step in fixing them." Mito nodded enthusiastically and Sasuke gave a curt nod. He smiled as they moved away and he called the next pair. "Your sister is very skilled." He tried his best not to stiffen at those words, so suddenly said as a figure moved next to him. He knew it was noticed though. "So is your brother." He inclined his head slightly. This man was an Anbu captain after all. "Did you train her?" he asked in a soft voice, a small current of interest in his voice. "I gave her some pointers." "I see." They stood silently, one not knowing what to say and the other being perfectly fine with saying nothing. They stood watching the sparring for a while. When Iruka had called an end to the class, the man turned his attention to the child, only 10 years old and already in the Anbu Corps. "You have been drafted into my squad, Naruto-kun. I will meet you at the Hokage's office at the given time." "Hi, Taichu." He bowed slightly. But that, Uchiha Itachi, recognized as one of the strongest shinobi in the village, disappeared with barely a flicker of movement. Mito hummed a happy tune as she exited the gates of the school. She had kept her lead against Sasuke after all. She still had a lead of 2 matches. She wasn't willing to let that number dwindle. Her face lit up in happiness as she caught sight of her brother, bounding over to him and wrapping him up in a hug. "Ani-san." She cried happily. "I missed you too today. Guess what, I beat up Sasuke again." She emphasized this point by making a fist and sending out a quick jab. He smiled softly at her as they turned a corner. She carried on talking, relaying every detail of the fight and all the highlights of her day, talking about anything that came to mind. Yes, he decided today was a good day. Chapter end. Chapter 6. Rods as weapons. His eyes shot open as the clock flipped to 6 a.m. Moving methodically, he straightened his sheets as he prepared for the day. He let his mind wander as he walked out of the small room, turning to the door on his right, he rapped his knuckles twice against the door. He stood for a few moments, there was no answer. A sigh escaped his lips as he moved further down the hall. Opening the door he moved into the bathroom, turning on his shower. Moving under the hot water was a relief. He felt so dirty, and the 3 showers he had had the day before hadn't helped in the least. Looking upon his hands in regret, his mind slowly moved to the event from the day before. He had killed, blood now stained his hands and his soul, a few tears blended with the water running down his face. He shook his head to rid himself of these thoughts. "No. This is the path I chose, I cannot go back now." He shook his head ruefully as a chuckle escaped his lips. He fell to his knees. Why does it have to be like this, why do? There was a sharp knock on the door, breaking him from his thoughts. "Ani-san. Hurry up." He stood quickly, shaking his head as he turned the water off. "Be patient, Mito, I am almost done." His voice was soft, but he knew he was heard by the scoff he received in return. A small smile made its way onto his face. He had reached the sink now, brushing his teeth to a rhythm only he could understand. His other hand slowly moved towards his fringe, lifting the hair out of the way. 2 small protrusions were visible. He touched the tip of one softly, staring at it through his own reflection, grimacing softly. If the villagers were to see these, he let his hair fall back into place, not wanting to continue that thought. He didn't know why they were growing, and he was much too worried to ask. "Ani-san." The voice was desperate now. Hi, he spoke as he let his hair cover the bumps once again. He'd only just opened the door when he was pushed out into the hall, and the door slammed in his face. It seemed she really was desperate. Not 10 minutes later he had a simple breakfast with rice and fish sitting in front of him, the other waiting for his sister, who slowly strolled into the dining area, dressed casually and still drying her hair. Morning Nai-san, her words came sleepily, she had yet to fully wake. He wanted to shake his head at that. Ninja were supposed to be able to move from sleep to conciseness in an instant. He knew however, that she had not been trained for that yet. Good morning Mito, he replied as she flopped into her chair and broke her chopsticks, ready to dig in, until a spoon smacked her right in the middle of her forehead. Tai, she moaned pitifully, giving her brother a pout. Manners, he spoke insistently. She groaned but clapped her hands together. Itadakimasu, Mito cried before diving into the food. He shook his head honestly. She would be lost without me, figuratively and literally. She had the worst sense of direction he'd ever seen. But the simple affair of breakfast over, and after he'd forced Mito to do the dishes. He moved towards the door with wallet in hand. Ani-san. Where you going? She was staring at him speculatively, almost as if accusing him of something. He sighed. Mito, I need to acquire high-grade weaponry. I have been commissioned a check from the Hokage to make these purchases. Her eyes lit up at his explanation, and a shiver ran down his spine. How much can you spend? She asked with a gleam in her eye. As much as I need, he said hesitantly. Her face lit up with enough energy to power Konoha and its neighboring towns. Then you're buying me new clothes. He wasn't able to respond as he was dragged out the door by a vice grip around his wrist. Meeting place, unknown location. His foot tapped the ground expectantly. He was irritated and moody, with better things to do with his time. Although the meeting was about a very important subject, it was a simple status update. Surely this could have waited, and the least his contact could have done was arrive on time. The tapping of a cane against stone let him know his company had arrived. He stood as the door opened, knowing he was once again going to have to play politics. Danzo-san, it is good to see you have made it. Danzo moved to the other end of the table, far too slowly in his opinion. And it is good to be here, Fugaku, the man spoke evenly as he sat, not an ounce of inflection present in his voice. Now then, I am to understand you had some important matters to discuss with me. Fugaku spoke with a small amount of disdain, letting his business partner know just how much he appreciated being kept waiting. Indeed, everything is moving along smoothly, no problems have arisen, and I expect it to stay that way. What of your end, Fugaku? The man grunted at that, obviously pleased with his words. The clan is prepared, no objections, we may proceed. Excellent, Danzo remarked. What of Itachi? Fugaku would have cringed if it wouldn't make him look weak. He loved his son, truly he did. But he had betrayed the clan. The Hokage's informant is being fed false information. He believes the clan will only be ready to move in a year, giving the old man hope that peace may still be bargained for. Danzo nodded his head. Very well, we mobilize in 2 months. Fugaku shot to his feet. What? 2 months? Surely you jest. The bandaged man smiled mockingly at him. Don't forget, Fugaku, you came to me, believing me to be your best chance at victory. And while I support you now, if you were to back out of the agreement, the Hokage might just find a very incriminating piece of evidence on his desk in the very near future. The old man gave him an oily smile. Fugaku had to take a few deep breaths after hearing this, knowing he was backed into a corner. He slowly sat, nodding his head slightly. We will be ready. Danzo leaned forward, his face expressionless. Once more, make sure that you are. But Naruto. And that's why I needed 3 smoke bombs, a goldfish and a jar of peanut butter, Mito exclaimed. The thought process she possesses truly frightens me. He decided not to comment on this though, seeing her self-satisfied grin made him realize nothing he could say would get through to her. You do realize, he began slowly, that all costs incurred will be forwarded to me once I have been paid. Mito smiled again. All the more reason to spend it. I need new clothes anyway, my old ones are kinda falling apart. She rubbed the back of her head sheepishly, knowing it was true, and he could only thank the heavens that she wasn't like other girls in their seemingly rabid need to be in possession of the newest styles. Very well, we may as well purchase a set of kunai and shuriken. Really? Her eyes sparkled as he nodded. You're the best, Ani-san. They had reached a weapons shop at this point. He strode in calmly while Mito bounded in as quickly as possible, moving up to look at the many different types of weapons. He marveled at the sheer scale of the store. With every sweep of his eyes his from became more obvious. This was an expensive place. A rough hand landed on his shoulder. Of course he had known it was coming, but having deduced the owner was no threat, decided to hold off on removing it. Oh, you there, son, you come looking for some kunai? The man had a jovial tone about his voice, and he could see the shock in his face as he turned towards him. He was surprised, however, when he received a smile once the shock had faded. He was an average-looking man, nothing remarkable in any way, someone who could blend in any crowd, with brown hair thrown into a messy hairstyle, brown eyes that sparkled with childish delight. The man was the epitome of normal, but not forgettable. So then, what can I get for you, Gaki? The man's deep but playful voice brought him back to reality, deeming him no threat to his or Mito's safety. He answered. I have come to acquire the basic stock of weaponry, class 4. The man stared at him in shock. You're really a shinobi? he asked with a hint of doubt. Naruto's response was to simply hand the man the check from the Hokage. The poor man's eyes seemed as if they'd pop out of his head. "I see," he said, softly scratching at the stubble on his chin. "Well then, I'd best be getting your stuff together, have a look around, and see if anything catches your eye." He gave the boy a small smile, obviously still quite shocked, and received a nod in return. The man moved into a back room behind the counter as Naruto strode off, looking for anything interesting. A few katana caught his eye, but not only would it take years to master such a weapon, it didn't feel quite right in his hands. He sighed as he set a pair of side down, wondering if he'd ever acquire a weapon that suited his style flawlessly. There would be no exceptions in that regard. He'd need something he could use practically and easily hidden, something that would not hinder him in tight spaces or slow him down in the open. He placed his hand on a bow staff, giving it a twirl before once again striking it from the list. Much too large, of course he would still try them out, even if he kept it in a ceiling scroll most of the time. He'd been in need of a weapon that was perfect for him, even if it went against his desire to be able to use it in tight spaces, as long as it felt right. A scream of youth violently jerked him from his thoughts as a man in a green spandex one-piece burst through doors of the establishment, followed closely by a man with silver hair and a face mask, slouched lazily with an orange book in his hands. Calm down, you're scaring the children." The man languidly motioned towards the spot where he stood, staring wide-eyed at this shinobi. Indeed, the flak jacket marked him as one. The man appeared before him in an instant, nothing more than a blur as he approached. Forgive me, I was merely enjoying the overflowing youth of our village." The man all but screamed. Naruto nodded dumbly at the man, not knowing quite what to say. A smile broke out that covered almost the entirety of his face. "My name is Mido Guy. The youthful green beast of Konoha." Naruto twitched slightly at that. This was Konoha's supreme master of Taijutsu. He tried to smile, but it was more of a grimace, and inclined his head slightly. "It is a pleasure to meet you, Mido-san." "Don't mind him." The silver-haired man was standing beside Guy now, calmly reading his book while giving half his attention to the child in front of him. "You're Naruto, right?" He wasn't very surprised at being recognized, it was nothing new after all. "That is correct." He lowered his head once again and received an upwards turn of the eye as the man snapped his book shut and slid it into his pocket. "My name is Kakashi Haddock, and my friend here has already introduced himself." Naruto stood rigid at this, not believing that he had the luck to run into two of Konoha's elite jounin. Their reputation certainly preceded them. "Yosh!" Guy screamed. "It warms my heart to see such youthful excitement." He cast his gaze over to where Guy was staring and noticed Mido was doing her best impression of a hyperventilating squirrel, staring at a pack of explosive tags with a pair of nunchaku in her hand, seemingly unable to decide between the two. She eventually grabbed both and headed towards him, no doubt wanting to ask for both, and froze when she saw Guy giving her a massive grin. "Ani-san," she called as she turned to him. "A pervert is trying to seduce me." "Sick em." Kakashi chuckled and Guy looked absolutely terrified, gaping like a fish while looking to Kakashi for support, which came not from the silver-haired man, but the white-haired boy. "Mido, show some respect." "That is Mido Guy, an expert in Taijutsu and one of the strongest ninja in the village." Mido seemed shocked, and Guy's face lit up once more, glad his talents were appreciated. "Yosh!" he cried. "It is truly youthful to be recognized by this generation's youth." The man was so excitable, how did he even become a shinobi? Mido tuned him out, probably trying to preserve her sanity, and turned towards her brother. "Ani-san," she thrust the exploding tags and nunchaku his way. "Can I get these?" she asked, seemingly radiating happiness. "Only the nunchaku," he told her with a firm gaze. She opened her mouth to protest, but it died when he glared at her. She huffed and turned away, moving to put the tags where she had found them. "Quite an interesting sibling you have there," Kakashi noted. "Youthful," agreed Guy. "Your praise is appreciated," he said and dipped his head in thanks. Kakashi waved him off as Guy smiled and moved back to the counter. The clerk had just emerged from the back. "Takumi-san. I have come to acquire new weapons for my most youthful practice." Guy once again gave a megawatt smile. And the clerk seemed to slump at the sight of the man. "I'll be right with you, Guy-san, just putting through that young man's purchase." He gestured to where Naruto and Mido were standing, the latter having joined him a few moments ago after putting the tags away. He noticed the nunchaku in her hand. "You buying that too?" He punched in a few numbers when he got a nod in response, handing over the pouch filled with the basic requirements of Anbu Basic Class 4 equipment: 24 kunai, 32 shuriken, 10 meters of high-quality weaved ninja wire, 5 explosive tags and 3 smoke bombs. Plus the nunchaku, comes to 16,000 ryo. He filled out a small piece of paper from behind the counter, writing the referral number on the check Naruto had given him. He'd be paid in full by the end of the week. Before handing the slip of paper back to the boy. "Anything catch your eye, kid?" he asked with a smirk, but frowned when he saw the child shaking his head. Unfortunately not, nothing seems to quite fit, Naruto replied. Well, let me know what you need. Then the man leaned forward over the counter. My pride as a blacksmith ain't no small thing, you know, the man spoke firmly. Naruto nodded his head in response. I'll inform you if anything catches my eye. The man nodded resolutely. I'll smith it myself if it don't exist. He tapped his fist to his heart. My pride's on the line after all. He'd handed Guy a package and punched in the numbers, all while speaking with the boy, staring at him seriously. Naruto dipped his head. You shall be the first to know. The Kumi nodded his head firmly. I best be, before giving him a smile and waving him off. He was approaching the door with his sister when Guy appeared in front of them, startling them both. Yosh! He cried, may I ask how you plan to learn the youthful art of nunchaku, Mito-san? Mito stared at him warily. My Nai-san will teach me, right? She asked as she turned to him for confirmation. He sighed and shook his head. I do not know how to wield nunchaku, Mito. She looked absolutely crestfallen as Guy's grin widened. Yosh! To the training ground, he shouted as he darted off, nothing more than a blur, leaving two very confused children in his wake. He wants you to follow him, Kakashi spoke with a sigh. Come on. He snapped his book open once more and started leading the children to Guy's usual haunt. 10 minutes later. They walked into training ground A. To an incredible sight, Guy was in a handstand doing vertical push-ups, screaming about youth and doing 100 laps around the village, maybe more terrifying than incredible. Naruto cast a glance to Kakashi, who was doing his best to ignore the man's antics, while Mito seemed ready to run. Yosh! Guy's bellow was much louder than when they were in the shop, perhaps that was his indoor voice. Mito-san. Join me so we may kindle our flames of youth into a burning passion of youthful vigor. She stared at the man, completely terrified as she turned her head to Kakashi, hoping for a translation. The man sighed once more. He wants to train you to use those, he clarified as he pointed to the nunchuka. He may look dull, but he's probably one of the best Taijutsu users in the world, and when he brings his nunchaku out, the man trailed off and shivered. While Naruto slightly relaxed at this, Mito seemed to shrink in on herself. Do I really have to? She whimpered and glanced at her brother. He shook his head, much to her obvious relief. I suppose if you never want to surpass me, then refusing training with one of Konoha's elite jounin is the best way to go about it. He spoke flippantly, as if it really wasn't a hassle. And a fire lit in Mito's eyes. I'll show you. She shouted and ran towards Guy. That was a mean trick, Kakashi chuckled, but effective. Even if Guy isn't the most sane of people, he knows what he is doing. Naruto nodded just as a loud yosh filled the air. With Guy seemingly having explained something to Mito. He put his thumb up and smiled wide. A beam of light seemed to bounce off his teeth and flashed into the eyes of an unsuspecting bird that was flying past, blinding the animal, which flew into a tree and broke its neck. Chapter end. Chapter 7. For whom the bell tolls. After a pleasant weekend, Monday was bound to roll around and Naruto found himself standing in the office of his cage. Tiger stood to the man's right, being one of his most trusted guards. He stood at attention beside Weasel and a group of 15 shinobi. The Hokage took a long pull from his pipe, savoring the taste of tobacco and mint, before heaving a sigh in their direction. Team Delta, Commander Weasel. His tone was sharp and authoritative. His men snapped into salutes and stood before him. You have been issued a mission to the border of Kiri and Konoha. The fighting has escalated and they are in need of reinforcements. Do you accept? His tone was daring, almost as if he wanted someone to refuse, just to show the others the consequences. Weasel took a step forward and bowed deeply to his cage. Team Delta will accept the mission, Hokage-sama. The old man nodded in approval, handing over a small scroll, and waved of the men standing before him dismissed. There was a flicker of movement and they were gone. Naruto reappeared in the Anbu base, making his way towards his commander's office. Seeing that he was the last to arrive, he silently took his place among his comrades, at attention before his commander. This mission has a minimum requirement of 2 months active leave. Weasel began. It's off the books, with only the Hokage and higher-ups in the know. We are to defend the borders from a force of an estimated 200 Kirin. No one is to know where you are going. Questions? The woman to the right of Naruto stepped forward. Sir, I was not aware we were having skirmishes with Kiri. Why now, and why is it classified? Itachi nodded at the woman. It's been kept of the books by Hokage-sama. A team on patrol was found slaughtered a few months back near the border. A team was sent in for diplomatic purposes, but after 3 weeks and no contact, we moved a team of Anbu into Kiri. Their bodies were found hung in a public square, with their eyes gouged out and fecal matter spread over the bodies. The fist of the woman next to him tightened dangerously, and everyone could feel the kai leaking from her high. When do we leave? Her voice was frozen. You have an hour to prepare. Meet at the West Gate. Weasel waved his hand in a dismissive gesture. And remember, no one knows where you are going. He received salutes from the entire squad before they flickered out of sight. Naruto. He opened the door to his house silently. It was early morning and Mito should be at the academy. He sighed as he realized he wouldn't be that lucky. Hey, Ani-san. Mito waved at him lazily, still in her sleeping clothes and seated at the table, playing with her breakfast. Shouldn't you be at school, Mito? He asked a bit desperately, not really wanting to put up with her antics. Hi, I just wanted to hear how it went. He nearly sighed, she wouldn't like this. I have been deployed, I leave in an hour. Seriously? She inquired. That was fast. She yawned here and looked totally uninterested. So how long till you to get back? 2 months. He spoke quickly, knowing what was coming. She nodded her head in acceptance before her eyes shot open and she sprung to her feet. 2 months? What the hell? Why are you go? Mito. She was cut off sharply. It is the order of the Hokage. He spoke softly, hoping to calm her. She slammed her hands on the table. Where the hell are you going for 2 months? She asked desperately. I cannot tell you. His answer seemed to infuriate her further as she got up and moved towards the door. Come on. We're going to speak to the Hokage about this. She had a fire in her eyes. Mito. His voice was low and could have cut diamonds with its sharp intensity. She recoiled as if he had physically struck her, staring at him in shock. Ani-san? She asked slowly, unsure of what to say to her brother that was giving her such a cold look. I have been deployed, he stated simply. Not only would going to the Hokage now make me look bad, it also paints a bad picture for any commander you may serve under in future. Insubordination is a black mark in any shinobi's dossier. She nodded slowly, not used to her brother when he was like this. She took a deep, shaking breath. Okay. She stared at him seriously. Now I understand. He nodded as he moved toward his room, planning to pack everything into a bag and then seal it into the scroll that was commissioned to him. His sister followed him, probably trying to spend as much time with him as she could before he left. He smiled softly, he would miss her. 5 hours later. They had been running for a while now. There was a palpable tension in the air and weary glances were cast his way, obviously uncomfortable and weary of his presence. The fact that he was so young garnered the attention of most. Captain Weasel called a halt to the proceedings, sending 5 men to set up a perimeter and keep watch before turning his attention to him. Tomorrow we continue southeast for approximately 2 days, whereupon we shall reach the border of fire and water. Be prepared, for you shall see the cruelty of humanity. If Naruto was confused by these words, he didn't show it. With Mito. The school day had just ended. Sitting through these boring lectures was beginning to fray her nerves. She honestly couldn't wait for the academy to end so she could become a real shinobi. Just like her brother. That thought caused her to frown further, despite the state in which he returned every night, namely, bloody and exhausted. She couldn't help but feel slight envy that he was being trained by such a well-respected group as the Anbu. Of course, he was never allowed to tell her just what that training entailed. It irked her somewhat, knowing he was advancing so quickly while she was left behind. But she knew these thoughts were petty. He had joined the Black Ops unit out of necessity, not choice, and he had helped her greatly with her Taijutsu and chakra control, allowing her to contend for first place against Uchiha Sasuke. A talented boy with a fan club a mile long, she'd imagine it would be the same for her, if not for one simple fact. Kyuubi. The thought of the great beast sealed within her navel brought a shiver down her spine. That night she had spoken to the beast was one she would never forget. Despite offering to strike a deal with her, it had been entirely vague as to what that deal would entail. And even more evasive with the facts of the night it was sealed, saying things like you will find out when ready or I do not wish to break your pitiful mind with things beyond your comprehension. So in other words, it was just blowing hot air and insulting her. She wouldn't be surprised if it was just lying to get out of its cage and had proceeded to tell it such. It had laughed at her. Laughed. And she would never forget its words, said with such assurance and pity. She sometimes wondered if it would have been best to accept the deal. The day will come, the day you will need my power the most. And on this day it will be denied, for if you cannot listen to mere words, how would you ever hear the call of your own anguish? She had woken suddenly after that, with her brother beside her and her heart racing. She would never consider that a dream. It made far too much sense, and it was far too real to be anything but reality. But those words would haunt her for many years. Pearson. He sat, staring out at the village. The village he had sacrificed so much for, the village that had taken his wife and child, and the village that spat on the memory of its heroes. Despite all this, he loved it with his whole heart, the children playing in the streets while the parents watched over with a smile, the market writhing with act. This is what made the village what it was, so peaceful and ignorant, so happy to go about their lives while the shinobi died, while other villages were slaughtered en masse. He briefly wondered if this was how Hashirama had envisioned the future. He knew the man's dream was to make sure every child had a decent childhood, without death and violence. He had wanted to spread this philosophy over the world. But after all that work, things hadn't changed much. If anything, death had just become more organized. Beside it that, knowing these dark thoughts did nothing, despite having taken so much, he was still willing to give what was left to the village he loved. The next day. He has just finished resting, the camp was covered and their passing untraceable. The shifting of his comrades did not escape his attention, most were still casting glances his way. Besides the captain, not a single person had spoken to him, he didn't care much however, he wasn't here to make friends. He would have welcomed a conversation, but it wasn't immediately necessary. Their captain spoke with a dragon-masked agent, their words unheard to the rest of the group. Before nodding as the man fell back into line. We have just received word that one of our outlying bases we have stationed in Kiri has been attacked. I plan to double our pace and reach the shore by midnight. After which a small barge will pick us up on shore and take us to one of the islands where the main base is located. This will also be your only rest until we reach camp. Questions? He received none, and they were sprinting through the trees a moment later. Undisclosed location. How are the troops faring, Au? A woman with ankle-length red hair queried. Most demoralized, May-sama. The recent losses have caused many to question whether it is still possible to win this war. A man with a spiky blue mane and an eye patch over his left eye spoke. The woman sighed, feeling no need to comment. She had guessed as much already, but one could always hope. Very well, order the men to hold position. We cannot lose that factory. Are you sure that is wise, May-sama? Surely there. Aoi, do as I say. Hi, May-sama. Team Delta. They had just recently disembarked from their 3-hour-long trip across the waters of Kurigakure. They had wasted many hours traversing the vast waters around the nation, but it was unavoidable, as even Jounin level ninja tire after a few hours of water walking. They needed to be fresh and prepared once they reach land, as there's no telling what could happen between that and the base. Itachi had spoken with the team, encouraging them to be more accepting of his presence, pointing out that he had also been young in age when he joined the Black Ops. This had at least stopped the glances, but still no one approached him. They were perhaps 5 minutes away from base, or at least if the continuous twitching of his captain's hands were to be believed. Breaking through the last of the foliage, they came across a few tents spread over easily evacuated points, with perhaps 10 men guarding the perimeter. He said nothing as they approached a nondescript tree, seemingly one of many, but with a wave of his hands and a few muttered words, the captain had dispersed the illusion over the true entrance, a simple trapdoor that led underground, wide enough for only 2 people walk side by side. He knew there must have been more exits, as this was more than likely the least defended, for if any enemies were to come this way, limited movement would allow the shinobi inside to attack with a simple fire technique, made all the more powerful by the narrow walkway. It opened up and his suspicions were confirmed, 2 shinobi snapped to attention upon seeing his captain. Or at least he assumed they did, they were walking side by side in pairs of 2, with the captain bringing up the front, so he couldn't actually see, being second last as he was. They continued until the room opened further, allowing them to spread out and be welcomed by the 30 or so shinobi that were present. Weasel had ordered them to rest, before being whisked off behind locked doors, which he assumed to be the command and intelligence room. His team was led off without much fanfare, they were told they would spend the night in a room that housed 4, although by the size of it, it would be a close fit. He was actually impressed by the base, a powerful Earth-style user must have carved it out. And looking around the small room in which sat 2 other men and 1 woman, he knew that comfort was not in mind when the place was made. There was tense silence in the air, more than likely due to his presence, he couldn't blame them though, he was an unknown. And in this world, unknowns tend to get you killed. There was shifting from the horse-masked man in the corner opposite his, before he seemed to come to a decision and slowly reached up to remove his mask. His face was average, forgettable and common, more than likely used to his advantage, he smiled disarmingly, but there was an unmistakable bitterness as spoke. Name's Koga Hachiro, Gaki. He placed the mask by his side and shifted around, trying to get some level of comfort against the stone wall. The woman moved next, slowly sliding her cat mask off her face as she turned to him. Yuzuki Yugao. She inclined her head towards him. The man to his right seemed hesitant, and after the mask was removed, he understood why, most of his face had been burned away by a fire technique. A grotesque smile seemed to be permanently plastered to the right half of his face. Mamoru, the man rasped, it seemed he'd taken a breath from whatever technique was launched at him. He slowly moved his hand to his own mask, slowly sliding off the design of a hawk. This moment would decide whether or not they could work as a cohesive unit. Uzumaki Naruto. His voice was soft as he revealed his face to the others. Mamoru's hand moved to his face as he rubbed his cheek, where he got it wasn't much of a mystery anymore. Koga seemed genuinely shocked, Yugao had tilted her head as she scrutinized him, and the burning gaze of Mamoru seemed to bore into his skull, but it was surprisingly the scarred man that spoke first. Called it. He spoke quietly as Koga handed him a tidy sum of money. Yugao made no move as she continued to stare, and Koga seemed put out on having to part with his money. Naruto stared quizzically at the man. You bet on my identity. The man smiled at him, although it seemed to be more of a grimace on his scarred face. I don't pass up free money, kid. You suddenly drop off the radar a few years back and now we got a new recruit that was either a midget or a prodigy, wasn't too hard to figure out. He nodded slowly, surprised that he was receiving no animosity from these people. Yugao seemed to pick up on his thoughts as she spoke. We hold no spite for what you contain. We all knew the fourth personally, and thinking his seal anything less than perfection would be an insult to his memory. Naruto nodded again. He never understood the seemingly godlike reputation the fourth had garnered. He was just a man, a dead man. He knew that he was supposedly one of the best shinobi of the last 100 years, but the devotion shown by most was unnerving. Koga smiled. Since we're all going to be working together, why don't we tell each other our fields of expertise? If only for the Gaki's sake. Yugao nodded. I specialize in Kenjutsu and close quarter combat. I know a few fire style techniques and have basic tier 2 sealing knowledge. Mamoru spoke next. I specialize in strategy and earth style ninjutsu. Koga smiled as he continued. I've got some impressive lightning style ninjutsu and I'm one of the best ninjutsu users in the village. He spoke as he rubbed his thumb under his nose, obviously proud of his skills. I am a close quarter specialist, focusing on Taijutsu. I also possess a single A rank wind style jutsu with 5 supplementary B ranks. The others wore impressed faces, obviously not expecting someone so young to be able to use such a powerful Futon jutsu. Well then, Koga nodded. Best to get some sleep. I have a feeling we only have a few hours. They all nodded and tried to get as comfortable as possible against a hard stone, weary and anxious for the days to come. 1 week later. It had been far too quiet for Naruto's taste. The tension was mounting and he felt like he was about to snap. Thankfully the captain seemed to notice he and the other 3 had formed something of a bond over the last few days and he was deployed with people he knew he could count on to have his back. Koga seemed to be a go-with-the-flow type of guy. Mamoru was stern and unwavering in his devotion to the village, but it was hard getting a lock on Yugao's feelings. She seemed high-strung and anxious, and he doubted it had anything to do with the mission, or at least not directly. They were currently patrolling one of the smaller islands, just south of the main island of Kiri. There had been no word on the base that was attacked. It seemed the higher-ups were keeping things from them. Mamoru stilled suddenly, causing the others to come to a stop. Enemies, 10. He was using Anbu hand code 2 clicks west, 8 to 3 minutes. They dove out the way and began laying traps. The order had come down just yesterday that tension was high between the villages, lethal force was authorized. Naruto could hear his heart pumping, his hands were shaking, and his body was trembling. What's happening, he questioned himself. His thoughts were cut off as a muffled thud was heard. A small group of shinobi had landed in the clearing. The obvious captain, for he strutted about as if he was nobility, moved toward the tree line. We know you're here, he grinned, a sickly sight to behold, yellowing teeth and ugly face, compounding this fact. How about you just come on you? His voice cut off as he took a step forward and the ground shook beneath their feet. Blood flew from the center of the blast and rained upon the clearing. Naruto took off, moving as fast as he could. He managed to slit the throats of 2 other men before they had regrouped. His heart pumped and his legs moved. His mind seemed to float away from him, this feeling. He was brought back to reality by a kunai narrowly missing his neck. His own blade ripping the man's throat out in turn. He twisted as he heard footsteps behind him. A man was moving through hand seals in a desperate gamble, one that did not pay off when Cat's sword pierced his heart. His gaze swept over to Mamoru, his right arm hanging limp and defending himself against 2 men. His body moved before he could stop it. A single bone ripped open his palm as he drove it forward, piercing the man's eye. One more push drove it through the brain, the other paused in shock, and Mamoru had already ended his life. He heard a gasp from Kat. She was staring at him in slight shock, but couldn't continue as she defended herself against a flurry of slashes. Mamoru nodded to him as he jumped up, going to assist Yugao. He knew there would be questions later. A thud let him know he had company. He twisted as a white blur moved past his face and gasped as his vision settled on his assailant. Stark white hair stood out amongst the dull backdrop of Kiri. A single sword of bone rested in her hands. Her clothes were a mess and she seemed starved. Madness shone brightly in her eyes. They shook with such intensity and focus as she studied the sword he held in his own hands. Her eyes finally moved to his and a savage smile broke out over her face. "Ma." She whispered the word, half of it getting lost in the sounds of battle. What, Naruto whispered, still in shock over seeing her. Her eyes flickered over to where he had killed the man attacking Mamoru, nothing but a pile of ash. "Mate." She screeched as she lunged toward him, his shock not having worn off. He was unable to move as he was pinned underneath her, fingers clawing at his pants and shirt, desperate to get through the material. She was moaning incoherently as his shock seemed to leave him, almost breathless. "Mate. Mate." She seemed absolutely thrilled, heedless of his thrashing. He was desperate now, throwing her arms away from himself, only to be pinned once more to the ground. Despite her appearance, she was terribly strong. He struck out as hard as he could, bringing his fist up into her diaphragm. She gasped, face twisting in a snarl, as she brought her head down and viciously headbutted him, shattering his mask. Stars danced in his vision as she once more pinned him, tearing his shirt. She bit down on his neck, drinking his blood, grinding into him and moaning, the previous battle all but forgotten to her. He struggled further, not wanting to be defiled like this. She didn't appreciate his struggles, and threw a vicious fist across his chin, and his world exploded, and the entire spectrum of sound shifted. A deafening shriek sounded in his ears. Her strength was no joke. His protests became weak as she shifted on top of him, delighted that he seemed to be cooperating, and a shadow filled the corner of his eye. Chapter end. Chapter 8. Wake me up. His world was still shifting as he floated in and out of consciousness, barely aware of the weight shifting atop him. As his mind clouded and vision swam, thoughts swirled in his mind as the darkness encroaching his vision finally took over. Warm arms suddenly wrapped around him from behind, snapping his eyes open from the unexpected contact. He found himself no longer in the clearing, having seemingly appeared in a wide and endless void. He wondered for a second if he died. Perhaps the blow to the head had been far stronger than he thought. "It's wonderful to finally meet you, my precious son." The voice tore him from his thoughts as he whipped around, trying to draw out a kunai, and then his very world ground to a halt. "Who are you?" Considering the situation, he found himself amazed that there was no hitch in his voice, no waver to his words, for the woman sitting in front of him was undoubtedly related to him. From her cascading snow-white hair, the smooth and aristocratic contours of her face, the thin lines situated on her forehead, and the calm and level expression she kept, the similarities were uncanny. She smiled softly at his question, a smile he realized was one reserved for those who held only the most special place in one's heart. "You know who I am, my precious one." Her voice seemed to be gifted unto her by the gods themselves. It spoke only of benevolence and an unending kindness as she gazed at him. He found his knees weak as he dropped his guard, a part of his mind screaming at him not to do so, the other part far too enraptured to care. "Mom?" The whisper that escaped his mouth was spoken so softly that one could have mistaken it for a breeze, but her smile widened as he gazed at her, not truly comprehending the situation. She held her hand out to him, long and finely filed nails that spoke of nobility were the first thing he noticed as he laid his hand in her own. "I have missed you." He found himself once more in her arms as she pulled him towards herself, wrapping him in a hug. His body froze at the contact, even as warmth flooded through his body. So this is the love of a mother, his thoughts whirled, but this was the most prevalent, even overriding the thoughts of just where they were. He lay within her arms for an amount of time that felt far too little to him as she shifted her body, not letting go, but now within his line of sight, all the while the smile had not left her face. "How?" Now that the tender moment was over, he asked a question his mind couldn't find an answer to. Her smile never wavered as she gazed at him with seemingly sightless eyes, a fact that he took note of before filing it away for later. There were more pressing matters after all. "All will be explained soon, my precious." Her voice truly was beautiful. It wouldn't be a far stretch to compare it to the hymn of the angels themselves. Coupled with her unearthly beauty, she could probably bring most men to their knees with, but a glance, the horns adorning her head, only seemed to add to this appeal, rather than hinder it. She stroked a hand through his hair, seemingly very pleased by its length and condition, which he realized he had inherited from her. Even after weeks of abuse it had retained its almost silk-like texture. He had never cared much for it, but was suddenly very happy it pleased this woman so. She withdrew her hand, placing it above his heart. "You have grown since I last saw you." Her words drove a wedge between the feeling of fulfillment and the reality around him. "I don't understand." He shook his head to clear the thoughts running rampant within his mind. "When I gifted you with the body of a warrior, my precious. Do you not recall?" Her voice was slightly disappointed as she gazed at him, but smiled as he shook his head. "I remember." His gaze swept out across the barren landscape, "but I don't understand where we are, or even how this is possible." His voice was laced with confusion before he turned his face to her. "Did I die?" She seemed shocked at his words, but after a moment her eyes softened. "No, my precious, you are still very much alive." Then how his hands had gripped his hair as he finally lost his composure, considering the possibility of insanity. It brought a sigh to her lips as she regarded him with a tender and understanding gaze. "You are well within the right frame of mind, my precious one. But unfortunately I just do not have the time to explain the complexities of our situation. Right now you are overwhelmed as is. It wouldn't do to simply add to that now, would it?" She explained in a soft and tender voice, running her thumb across his cheek. He pulled away suddenly, making her look at him in shock. "No." His voice was slightly more forceful, surprising them both. "I need to understand." He finished far more softly than when he had begun, and was surprised to see a smile once more blossom on her face. Very well, she conceded. It brings me happiness that my precious one is eager to understand, for that is what the world lacks the most, so much so that they cannot even understand what is best for them. Her eyes had turned slightly cold to accompany her words, a stark contrast to what he had seemed so far, but they once more softened at his inquisitive face. The realm we currently occupy, she made a wide sweeping motion with her arm, is what you might consider the soul, or rather the consciousness itself. She ran a tender hand through his hair once more before continuing, I have come here to both enlighten your mind and strengthen your body. He stared at her in confusion, he simply couldn't comprehend how something like this was possible. She caught onto this as she smiled at him. Well, in most cases this would be impossible. A being as powerful as myself is able to bend reality to suit their needs. However, even with all my strength I cannot stay for long. Reality is fickle and will eventually reject me. What you see before you is my own soul. I have come from the pure world to speak with you. The pure world? He asked in confusion. That is a place where all souls go to be cleansed before being reincarnated or sent to paradise. He nodded slowly at her words, running possibilities through his mind. Then how are you able to speak to me? Are you in this so-called paradise? She shook her head slightly at his words. No, my precious one, a soul with unfinished business may not move into either until they are satisfied. He nodded again, coming to terms with this. So I'm your unfinished business? She nodded with a smile. In part, yes. You are the center of which this unfinished business revolves. He realized quickly that her words were extremely vague and decided to point it out, the center. So there's more to it than just me. She sighed softly at his words. I cannot tell you much now, my time here is already running low. He started at her words, only now noticing her fading body, seemingly becoming translucent. Wait. I have so many questions, so many things I don't understand. He had never raised his voice in desperation before, but he found he could do nothing less in this situation. My precious one, I have no more time left. She moved forward slowly, placing the lightest of kisses on his forehead as her hand moved under his shirt. He was about to question her before she twisted and a blinding pain erupted from his stomach, making him stage her back. What? He rasped between clenched teeth. She wrapped her arms around him once more. I am simply giving you back what should have been yours since birth, something the foolish mortal decided to seal. He wanted to question her words, but something else came to mind. But outside, I was being. She placed a finger on his lips. Now no more than an upper body, my precious. What do you do with a wild animal? The question seemed rhetorical as she continued. You tame it. But those words, she disappeared, taking the warmth with her. You go. She was still rushing towards her downed comrade when his eyes suddenly snapped open, confusion evident but the determination even more so. His eyes gazed up coolly at the girl on top of him. She was just about to lunge forward when it happened. Every single person stopped their fight to stare in shock as a veritable wave of chakra washed over the clearing emanating from the downed boy, Yugao's blade a few inches away from the girl's neck. In a stunning display of pure power, the chakra suddenly lurched, launching the girl straight into the air. A sickening crack sounded through the air as she hit a low-hanging branch, blasting through it before her flight arsed, and she hit the ground with a thud. The child had stood while everyone's gaze followed the girl through the air, the ground cracking around his feet as the silver energy surrounded him, wrapping around his body. Long wisps of chakra emerged from his body, shining like the full moon in the night sky. He took an unsteady step forward, the ground cratered at his feet before his head shot up, and everyone took a step back. The wisp suddenly shot out like a whip, striking the last four enemies Koga was attempting to deal with. Mamoru was laid out on the floor, bleeding but still alive. The whips of pure chakra tore straight into their flesh, all of them blinking in shock. That's when the screaming started. The three men and single woman howled in absolute agony, the reason becoming clear as seconds later the flesh around where they had been pierced began to turn a dark shade of black, as if the chakra was eating away at their skin, a very accurate approximation. It didn't last very long, however. When blood started to run out from their eyes and ears, the screaming stopped and the tendrils disappeared. The boy took another staggered step forward, finally regaining his bearings as he trudged over to Mamoru, the man staring in shock, but not fear, as he laid his palm against his chest right where the heart was. A warm golden glow began to emanate from his palm, with the man visibly relaxing at his touch, the visible wounds disappearing in seconds. The groan caught the attention of all those still alive, but none more so than the white-haired boy, who stood on sure feet, seemingly recovered from whatever shock had caused him to stumble earlier, as he made his way over to the girl, who snarled at him when he reached her. But the visible flex of his hands, his chakra thickened and cracked the ground, making the girl whimper before lowering her head in deference. Seemingly satisfied, he turned, the girl scrambling to her feet before coming to stand beside him, head lowered and posture slumped. They all stood like that for a while, nearly unblinking as they processed what had happened. Well, I'll be damned, Koga, in his typical fashion, broke the silence. 5 minutes later. The trip back to base was done in silence, looks were passed between all those present. Respect and awe was the most prevalent among them, they had never seen such a phenomenon after all. It wasn't all that surprising that their captain stood at the entrance on their arrival, concealed eyes flicking to Naruto's unmasked face and the girl beside him. "Report," he ordered softly. Naruto stood silent as his team broke down the happenings of the past hour. He wasn't included for obvious reasons, the main one being that his mind seemed too far away. His teammates passed it off as shock after what happened. Itachi knew better, but wouldn't pry, as long as he felt it wouldn't be harmful to the mission, and only Naruto truly knew just what turmoil his emotions were in right now. The next day. He stood in the shower, eyes roaming his body as he allowed his chakra to circulate his coils, the seal upon his stomach visible as he stared downwards. It was notably different, the one solid black design had opened in the middle, seemingly making a small hole within the spiral. This was his proof, the only physical evidence that what had happened the day before was not just his imagination. He slowly turned the water off, the seals lining the pipe stopped glowing, no longer needing to warm the water. It was a small concession granted to them, and one they could all appreciate. A hot shower after a tough battle was much appreciated, no one needed to worry about using too much either, the pipes were fed directly into a nearby lake. And the heat seals only required a slight application of chakra to activate. The door clicked open as someone made their way inside. He was quite surprised to find Yugu standing there. Tears stained her cheeks as she glanced up, seemingly noticing him for the first time. She turned and bolted, a stuttered apology leaving her lips. Mildly embarrassed, but also realizing that Yugao must be in serious emotional turmoil right now, he got dressed as fast as possible and went after her. "Barracks." He found her curled up in the corner of their room, the tears had stopped, but the air of despondence remained. He walked up slowly, sitting down at a comfortable distance, careful not to move too close. Every shinobi had a comfort zone, and he hadn't known her long enough to know what that was. They sat for a while in silence. Naruto had considerable experience consoling Mito. He knew if she was going to talk, she would never do so with him trying to force it. It was around 5 minutes later that she spoke. His deader voice was soft, she didn't move her eyes from the ground. He stayed silent, and sure enough she turned her head to look at him. "Hey, he went into the field a few months before I did, he wasn't even supposed to be there." He put his name forward in a meeting with the Hokage. She choked a bit on her words, but otherwise seemed to be getting her message across. There was silence for a few seconds. "You loved him?" Even though it was a question, both knew it to be more of a statement. Yugao blinked back at her as she nodded. I think I was starting to. She was forcing out the words through gritted teeth. "I don't understand your pain, since it's just been me and Mito since the beginning. But just thinking of losing my sister hurts. I can't imagine what you're going through." He was never one for this though. Basic physiologically was taught to all Anbu, mostly to help people who have fallen into shock or to help them move on from a lost loved one. Just like this. He couldn't have Yugao like this, she would be ineffective out on the field, potentially killing him and the team. No, he had to sort this out. Even if his words about Mito were true. She nodded to him, seemingly feeling slightly better at his comforting words. Humans were simple like that, in need of contact, reassurance and love. Although there were the exceptions. "I'm sorry for your loss." He nodded slowly at her, before rising to his feet. "We have a briefing in 10 minutes, will you make it?" He wasn't looking when he asked, but she had the smallest of smiles on her face. As she looked at his back, she sniffed slightly. "I'll be okay." He nodded once before walking out the room, hopeful that his talk had at least made her reliable out in the field. She stared after him, grateful for his words. Chapter 9. Voices. "I won't ask you again, girl." The sound of an echoing slap followed these words, but beyond that, there was only silence. The masked man growled as he stared down at his current ward, a lithe and enunciated white-haired girl. She stared back, her countenance one of boredom, eyes glazed over, to the point he wondered if she realized she was not alone in the room. Shackles bound her wrists, inscribed upon the iron restraints were faintly glowing seals, designed to paralyze and negate the flow of chakra. He sighed at this point, almost pleasantly. "Whatever then, it's not my problem from here on out anyway." He signaled to someone cloaked in the shadows, a form nearly indistinguishable from the rest of the room. The darkness shifted, and from it emerged a woman, one with long blonde hair, tied in a messy bun. But any other features she had were hidden by the black garb and white mask that was worn. "It's your turn now." The captain was very specific about exactly how much harm could come to her. "No more than a few bruises was what he told me, and that's very obviously not working." He scoffed when he was waved off by the woman and froze thereafter as a voice. Plain as a blank sheet of paper resounded off the walls of the room. "That will be quite enough, Mouse." He stood by the door, form bathed in a strange mixture of darkness and light, his existence seemingly at odds with the natural order of the world, and the man shivered, disturbed on an instinctual level merely by the presence of this person. "Of course, Captain." He snapped a sharp salute and made for the exit, but his eyes found another, smaller form, hidden in the shadows of the room, right next to the captain, and his flesh stood on end. For there was a certain wrongness to this form's bearing, something otherworldly and vile. His senses were going mad merely being in the presence of these monsters. His foot passed the threshold, and the door slammed shut behind him. Freaks, the both of them. He shook his head of those thoughts and moved away, trying to ease his turbulent emotions. At ease, dear, the agent relaxed at his tone, but did not move from her spot. She had not been ordered to, after all. Now then, the captain spoke. I would like some answers, and you will be giving them to me. Dear stiffened at the words, as even though they had not been intended for her, the quiet promise that lay beneath his words was easy to understand. It was not merely a statement either. More along the lines of an assurance that no matter what may happen, there would be answers. But the girl was ignoring him. Her once distant and glazed eyes had locked onto the smallest form within the room. One could practically feel the excitement vibrate within her. Only him. Her eyes had shifted, boring into the holes cut within the porcelain of the captain's mask. I'll only talk to him. The captain had cocked his head at her words, and Deer was sure that at any moment the girl would be screaming, spilling her guts after being trapped in some horrifying illusion. But, to her utter astonishment, he nodded once, turned, and motioned her to follow. The great iron door closing with a final creak of steel behind them, and she could only wonder just what had possessed the captain to leave the rookie alone with a high-profile captive. She stared upon him, like a predator eyeing its next meal. It was unnerving in a way, the single-minded tenacity she gazed upon him with, as if he was the only thing that existed within the world at that moment. Off he was broken from his thoughts, as the girl uttered a single word, although he did not know what she wanted. Take your mask off. Her words were louder, more aggressive, and yet he could also sense the desperation boiling beneath the surface. Perfect. I might, he uttered, wistfully, but first, I'm going to need you to answer a few questions that I have for you. Her face twisted into a scowl, but she held her tongue. What questions? She asked, looking almost pained to do so, and he smiled behind the smooth white of his mask. Firstly, he began, is where your allegiance in this war lays, and just what you were doing with a party of loyal Kirin. Her face had split into a horrifying grin at his words. A hacking laugh racked her body, sounding more like a cough than anything else. Loyalty. This time, she actually did cough violently. I owe my loyalty to no one. I was following them to have some fun, you know, the good old hack and slash kind of thing. She was smiling broadly, but her face suddenly fell, her posture going slack as she looked away, pink dusting her cheeks. But if I was loyal to anyone, it would be you. He was on guard the moment her personality took such a drastic shift, but from what he could see, she had nothing planned and in fact, did not even seem to be trying to escape. He did not relax, pondering her words and contemplating her vexing actions. Very well, he allowed. Where did you come from and how did you escape the purge of the Kagaya? She smiled at him once more, the picture of innocence. Mama hid me in the forest when they came. She told me not to move, but something hit me in the back of the neck, and when I woke up, I couldn't find Mama anywhere, and the clan house had been burned down. There were tears in her eyes. She stared into his very soul with her coal-like eyes, but once more, something shifted. So ever since, I've been wandering around, looking for things to kill. Her eyes were once more hard, bearing violent. He nearly reeled from such a sudden change. So, any other questions? He stared at her for a long, drawn-out moment. Just one, would you be willing to become an asset to the great village of Konoha? The silence that followed his question stretched on for what may have been an eternity, her expression one of shock. And once more, something changed. Her face softened, her head drooped and her eyes grey-wide as she stared upon him with hope etched upon her face. Really? She whispered, tears gathering in the corners of her eyes, you can really take me away from here? He nodded once and she lurched forward but came to the realization that she would not be able to reach for him, so she settled for the most heartfelt smile she had to offer. Thank you, she whispered, softly, reverently. But her face hardened and she spat at his feet. Don't take me for some sort of fool. There's no way I could get out of this place. You're just trying to bring my hopes up, aren't you? She drew in a deep breath, attempting to stifle her rage. Do you get off on that sort of thing? That's got to be it, get a girl's hopes up so that when you drive the knife through her stomach it's all the more satisfying, you bastard. He regarded her silently for a few moments, his form still in the wavering light of the single torch upon the wall. Slowly, he reached for his cloak, shifting it over his shoulder so that it rested upon the middle of his bicep before a bone grew, slow and steady as the seasons. It grew from his shoulder, its shape slowly becoming that of a katana. A testament to his skill and the bloodline he wielded. I would not be so quick to judge, he said, in an even and monotone voice. The Hokage has already cleared your transfer to the village, so long as you prove to be non-hostile and ready to cooperate. As you can see, I possess the same blood limit as you. When this one person more will not affect the outcome of our situation. His voice was a slow drawl, meant to belittle and anger the one spoken to. He expected her to EXP load, whereupon he would play his full hand and if all went well, agree to join the village. But there was no need. As she stared at him, moments passed, perhaps minutes. Finally, she looked him in the eyes, tearing her gaze from the bone protruding from his shoulder. "If you're lying to me, I'll make sure to haunt you from the afterlife, and be assured, I'll rend my penance from your flesh when you arrive at the gates." He smirked. It was so much easier than he had thought it would be. He had left without removing his mask or giving her anything she had originally wanted. He supposed that she had ended up forgetting anyway. He had left her in such a state of disrepair and emotional turbulence as it was, if it ever became important. An almost inaudible thud sounded out next to him and he almost sighed. Yugu had become nearly insufferable as of late, always hounding him for a conversation and comfort. He put a smile upon his voice as he addressed her. "Kat-san, how surprising it is to see you so early in the morning. Shouldn't you still be asleep in the barracks with the others?" A sigh sounded out from behind her mask. "Naruto-kun, how many times do I have to tell you to call me by my name before you get it?" Her voice, while professional and monotone, carried a certain weight of annoyance and playfulness that he simply could not wrap his mid around. The past 3 days had been annoying to say the least, but, he had to admit, he was starting to enjoy the back and forth banter that had recently become a norm between them. She was interesting and ambitious, to say the least. One does not simply dream of becoming the world's most foremost mistress. "I might remember the next time we speak, Kat-san." His plans were running smoothly, agents in place and an entire clan waiting upon his whims. He sank back into his chair, satisfaction pouring out into the atmosphere, emanating from his very soul. He was so very close, his dreams, his ambitions. Soon they would all come to fruition. Years of manipulations and planning were finally coming to a head. He leaned back further upon his throne, a throne that would be traded in soon for a more grandiose one, a more ruthless one. "It will be for the best, Hiruzen. Your time is at an end and I shall be the one to usher in the true age of shinobi. And you will be remembered as nothing more than a vile mockery of what a shinobi is and what they are bred for. Your time has come." A slow, haunting laughter emerged from his aged lips, a promise of pain, a promise of change. End chapter. What if Naruto was stronger than Hagoromo? And thanks for watching my video till the end. If you enjoy this content, then do consider subscribing to my channel and leave a like if you guys need the next part. Comment down and thanks for watching the video and see you guys in the next video.